The two of them experimented on Nick's ability to turn into mist. Luckily, due to their previous experience, they managed to unlock it rather early. It barely took 2 months. Naturally, they also found a way to expand the ability a little bit. Since Nick also assured the technician that he had already dealt with his main ability, Nick was technically ready to continue. All his abilities worked again, and they had even been improved. Additionally, the Specter core had increased Nick's speed of Zephyx recovery and the size of his storage by quite a lot. Compared to someone on the same level, Nick was gaining Zephyx almost 4 times as quickly, and he had thrice as much Zephyx. On top of that, Nick's abilities had also been elevated to a higher level. All in all, this newfound way to create specialists had proven to be extremely beneficial. Sadly, advantages could have disadvantages, and disadvantages could have advantages. The advantage of being able to generate one's own Zephyx sadly came with a disadvantage. In a way, benefiting from human suffering was inherently parasitical, and while one parasite usually wouldn't damage a host too much, if the host were filled with parasites, it would die. Humanity could support feeding one Nick, but they wouldn't be able to support 1,000, maybe not even 100. There were only so many bad people that could be punished. If there were more people like Nick, there wouldn't be enough suffering to go around for everyone. Either they would advance much slower or they would have to inflict suffering on innocent people. Additionally, the inherent stress of constantly being in an alert state of fight or flight could turn people mad. The technician decided to officially call this new state Half-Specter. That title described the power and the risk associated with it very well. Naturally, the technician and the left arm had talked about these dangers in private, and in the end, they were glad that Nick had such an abnormal psyche. They could see that Nick's ideology had been firmly shaped and put in place by years of extreme emotional torture, so thoroughly that even his logic followed it completely. Nick wanted to be a good person. However, that wasn't his goal for some holy and selfless reason like just making others happy. In fact, Nick wasn't even reaping any emotional rewards from helping others. Whether he helped or damaged others, there wouldn't be a big emotional difference. He felt almost identical in both cases. Nick was helping others solely to repay the debt he was perceiving. He just wanted to redeem himself. Such a mindset was obviously unhealthy and abnormal, but exactly that was what made Nick perfect to become a half-specter. Almost every single human was guided by emotions. Even extremely logical humans were guided by emotions, just very differently than one would think. Why did people make logical decisions? Because they wanted to make the right decision. And why was it so important to make the right decision? Because they wanted to feel good. Feel secure by having money, feel companionship by having a partner, feel community by having friends, feel status by having a good job, feel fun by following one's hobbies. All of that could be put together under the word happiness. Humans chased happiness, whether they were animals that solely followed their instincts or scientists that followed logic and reason. Everyone wanted happiness. Nick also chased happiness. However, compared to others, it was almost impossible for him to ever find it. Yet he kept chasing it, probably forever. And the best way to achieve happiness was to remain a good person in Nick's mind. Because of that, Nick had a uniquely fitting disposition for becoming a half-specter. If Nick had been less broken, Aegis might not have risked investing too much in him in the future. Sure, in the short term, they would still invest in him and experiment on him, but would they ever consider letting him become a protector? Definitely not. Luckily, that was not how Nick was. Nick's mindset was a disadvantage most times he interacted with others, but in this case, it was an advantage. That's everything, right? The technician asked with a complacent smile as Nick transformed back into his material form. Nick nodded. Since I have already fixed my main ability, I can say that the Specter core has been fully integrated. All in all, I would call this a success. My power has increased by a lot. The technician grinned as he scratched his chin. Right now, he was thinking about all the possibilities, if they could make more half-specters. Sadly, problems after problems shot through his mind. How? Naturally, Aegis had already tried the method of forced suicide to get a Specter to capitulate, but they had never managed to convince the Specter that they would actually go through with it. Additionally, they needed to experiment more to see how being a half-Specter impacted Nick's mindset. There were many things they had to consider. I'm ready for ability advancement, Nick said while the technician was thinking about the possibilities of half-Specters. When the technician heard Nick's words, he put his current thoughts to the back of his mind and looked at Nick. Nick wasn't sure, but he felt like the technician's demeanor had subtly changed after he had said that he was ready for ability advancement. "Sure," the technician said. "Do you have an ability in mind?" "Do we have a list of available Specters and what they can do?" Nick asked. The technician furrowed his brows with a bit of annoyance, eliciting a raised eyebrow from Nick. That was an unusual reaction from the technician. "Sure, but hurry up," the technician said before sending Nick's barrier a file with abilities for Specters. There were hundreds. "So which one is it?" the technician asked after a couple of seconds. Nick furrowed his brows. What was up with the technician? "I'm still thinking. I don't want to rush this since this has an impact on the remainder of my life," Nick said. The technician looked conflicted. "What about one of these 5? He asked as he highlighted 5 Specters. Nick looked closer at them. Sadly, the technician didn't know about Nick's main ability, which was the reason why the 5 Specters he had chosen were not what Nick wanted. "No, I want something else," Nick said as he looked at the other Specters. The technician took a deep breath. "Nick, you should really hurry up with your choice." "Why?" Nick asked, looking at the technician. "Just hurry up, okay? I can't tell you more, just trust me on this, okay? I don't want to hurt you," he said. These words made Nick nervous. When the technician saw Nick's skeptical expression, he started to roughly scratch the side of his head in frustration. "Arg, listen. Usually I wouldn't make a big deal out of this, but you're our only half-Specter. I don't want to lose you to some random force of nature, okay? You're kind of important," the technician explained. The technician looked at Nick, who still seemed quite uncertain. Finally, he just groaned. "Nothing of what I say will leave this room, get it? If this gets out, I will kill you, understand?" he said with a severe and urgent voice. Nick was taken aback, but he nodded with a serious expression. "I will keep it just as secret as my main ability." The technician watched Nick for a second. Then he looked around the room a bit. Finally, the technician's voice appeared in Nick's mind. "The Maw really likes fights between extractors that have used it for their ability advancement. It often abducts people when they are ready to advance, allows them to reach the next level while inside of it, and then makes them fight each other. Research has shown that the word ability advancement increases the likelihood of being taken by the Maw by quite a bit. Usually, I would even encourage you to enter a contest with the Maw since you would gain an amazing ability, but you are not a pure human anymore. You are a half-Specter, and we don't know how that will affect the Maw's judgment. It might just directly kill you after abducting you. So please hurry up with your choice. I don't want to tempt fate," the technician rapidly explained. Nick took a deep breath. He had no idea. That explained the technician's urgency. "I understand," Nick answered. "I want this one," Nick said 2 seconds later, highlighting one of the Specters. The technician nodded and told Nick to follow him. The two of them went upward a couple of floors until they entered the floor with the Specter Nick wanted. The technician opened the door, and a big hole filled with teeth appeared below Nick. Nick's eyes widened in horror. The technician's eyes widened in horror. "But I just regained my powers," Nick thought. "Does this really have to happen now?" And then the Maw engulfed Nick. Chapter 605, Taste. It was difficult for Nick to accept what had just happened. He was just about to undergo his ability advancement, and now he had been abducted by the Maw. There were several things that were hard to accept. First, Nick had been safe inside Aegis headquarters for years by now, and now he suddenly got taken away. Second, this had happened right after the technician had warned him. In a weird way, it would have been easier to come to terms with if the technician had simply said it outright. Third, this was an Eternal. Eternals were always very special, and interacting with any of them was something that happened extremely rarely. People rarely interacted with the Nightmare since they avoided it constantly. If people interacted with Nurse Alice, it was almost always only once in their lives. Nobody interacted with the Null. The sun was ever present, but its presence was barely felt since it was almost like a law of nature. It was just always there. And not many people interacted with the Maw. After all, it was only interested in Extractors, and the vast majority of Extractors were never kidnapped by it. In Crimson City, some of Nick's employees had vanished without any trace. Naturally, this could have happened due to other Specters or manufacturers, but there was also a possibility that they had been kidnapped by the Maw. Nick had not met anyone in Crimson City who had been kidnapped by the Maw and had survived. Back then, Nick had simply thought that being abducted by the Maw was very rare, but that was not the entire reason why he had never seen anyone who had survived. In general, the Maw kidnapped a number of people with a multiple of 8, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so on. If some people in Crimson City had been kidnapped by the Maw, at least one of them should have been able to win and survive, right? According to the odds, yes. However, there was an issue. Anyone below the level of hero that managed to win would basically die anyway. Why? Because the Maw didn't care about where it released its winner. It didn't put the people back from where it had abducted them. Newbies and Johns would very quickly die to any wild Specter. Veterans and experts might be able to reach the closest city, but they wouldn't have any way to get home. Most of the time, they were just killed on sight or absorbed by one of the local manufacturers. There were some reports about surviving specialists, but not that many for the same reason. A powerful specialist that a manufacturer could kill without incurring any enmity from a powerful manufacturer. Great, that was some good Specter fodder. Heroes were the only ones that could return home with a high level of confidence. First of all, they could fly and were very fast. Second, fighting a hero was always dangerous, even for an entire city. Luckily, Nick had a barrier and a uniform from Aegis, making it much easier to survive. As long as he found a city, he could just walk in and nobody would dare to attack him. But he had to survive first. Nick was engulfed by an extending hole filled with teeth and eyes. He could barely discern any flesh since everything was covered in teeth. Eyes, teeth-filled eyes, eye-filled teeth, teeth growing out of teeth, eyes growing out of eyes growing out of teeth, and so on. Nick felt watched by all of his surroundings, and obviously his ability had already deactivated. The Maw was watching him closely. Nick didn't dare to attack his surroundings. Angering the Maw might cause it to kill him. The floor below Nick opened, and he began to fall into a long hole filled with teeth and eyes. The teeth touched his barrier, making it fuzz and spark. Nick felt his Zephyx reducing and refilling rapidly. The teeth definitely damaged his barrier, but they did not do enough damage to use up Nick's Zephyx. Busy. More and more sparks came out of Nick's barrier, and it became extremely fuzzy. As Nick continued to fall, his barrier distorted. Bang! Then the white barrier surrounding him broke apart, and its white shell was immediately absorbed by the eyes. At the same time, Nick felt something explode on his chest. Nick's heart nearly stopped. His barrier had broken. As in, it was actually broken. The device just exploded. The entire device had become useless, and Nick was stuck without a barrier until he could purchase a new one. As soon as Nick's barrier broke, the teeth and the eyes began to retreat as the hole widened significantly. This change was so sudden that it couldn't be a coincidence. These teeth and eyes were explicitly designed to destroy barriers. A moment later, Nick saw something approaching from the bottom. Bang! Nick was hit by a huge wall of moist flesh. For a moment, he wasn't sure what this wall was, but then it moved. The wall moved upward in a rolling motion, and Nick fell behind the wall. That's a tongue. Yes, the big wall of flesh had been a huge tongue. Bang! An instant later, Nick was hit by another tongue. But this time, he didn't fall past it immediately. Instead, countless smaller but very long tongues broke out of the big tongue and encased him. The tongues went through his clothing, licking his entire body. Nick felt a cold shudder going throughout his body. He was helpless. He couldn't do anything against this. Surprisingly, Nick had stopped falling as the tongues tasted him. He felt like this wasn't supposed to happen. A moment later, Nick's heart nearly stopped, and he gritted his teeth. One of the tongues was trying to get into his mouth, and he refused to let it in. Crack! But it didn't care. It pushed Nick's teeth in, ignoring the shards and traveling down his esophagus and windpipe. Nick had to heave uncontrollably, but that didn't help. Crack! Then Nick felt a strong pain from inside his body. The tongue had pierced past his stomach and lungs, stretching and exploring the insides of his other organs. They were tasting all of him. Nick tried to bite down on the tongues and tear at them, but they were indestructible. At the same time, several other tongues made their way into his body through his other holes, digging through him, searching for something. And then one of them touched his Specter core, and immediately after, all the tongues went towards it. A normal human would have long since died, but Nick was an extractor. He still had his Zephyx, and as long as he wasn't out of Zephyx, he could survive something like this. When the tongues gathered around Nick's Specter core, he realized what was happening. They are confused by my Specter core. They've never seen anything like this and don't know what to do with it. Nick's body was suspended in the air, over 20 long and thin tongues keeping him there. He was bleeding profusely as his arms and legs helplessly flailed in the air. The tongues wound around his Specter core, and Nick felt immense pain. They were compressing it. Nick felt like he was a tiny insect in the hands of a curious toddler. He was completely at its mercy. If the toddler became bored, he would be killed. Maybe the toddler would tear all of his limbs off just to watch what he would do first. For several seconds, the tongues just tasted Nick's Specter core as they increased their strength. Nick's panic increased. I'm going to die. It's going to kill me. Its grip strengthened. Crack. A crack appeared in Nick's Specter core. When it did, some of Nick's human Zephyx broke past the Specter core for the first time and entered his body. Nick's Zephyx synchronizer was no longer perfectly isolated by the Specter core. The tongues let go of the Specter core and focused on the crack. They all gathered in front of it and consumed the Zephyx. 2 seconds later, they all pulled back, and finally, they left Nick's body. Bang! The big tongue Nick was lying on moved, and Nick fell past it. He continued falling weakly, his body filled with blood and saliva. Yet at this moment, Nick could only feel relief. I'm not going to die. In this case, falling further represented entering the Maw's competition, which meant being viewed as human, which meant having a chance to survive. If the Maw deemed him a Specter, he would have already been killed by the tongues. Bang! Nick landed on another tongue, but this one wasn't like the others. It was filled with razors. The tongue moved Nick around and tore his clothes off, as well as quite a bit of his skin. After falling past several more tongues, Nick was left without any clothing. He was only left with his 2 blades and about 10 throwing spears that were stored as small cylinders. Bang! And then Nick hit the ground. Chapter 606, The Wait. Nick's body healed within a couple of seconds, and he stood up to look around. He found himself in a fleshy room that was about 3 meters wide and long. The walls were filled with miniature versions of the hole that had swallowed Nick, their rims lined with teeth that seemed to lead into another hole filled with teeth. In a way, the smaller maws looked a bit like mouths, which reminded Nick of his old boss, Julian. Nick was the only one inside the room. After looking around, he quickly found his weapons lying around him. His 2 blades had been torn off his body by the tongues, and they lay in front of him while all of his spears lay around the room. While Nick rarely used his spears nowadays, he still carried 10 around with him. He quickly grabbed his 2 blades and put them back onto his arms. This immediately alleviated Nick's distress. Then Nick looked at his scattered spears. After looking at them for a while, he decided against picking them up. Why? Well, Nick was naked. Where was he going to store them? For the next several seconds, Nick just sat in the middle of the room. The things that had happened to him went through his mind again and again. He was used to many kinds of torture, but this was a new one. He had felt completely powerless, and he had not chosen to feel this way. It was inevitable to feel powerless while working with some of the Specters, but before it happened, the Extractors had decided to go through with this. Here, Nick hadn't had that luxury. He had been forced to go through this experience. Even more, Extractors generally knew that they would survive working with a Specter, while this hadn't been the case here. The Maw could have killed him. In fact, it had come dangerously close to killing him. If Nick's Specter core had broken in a more unfortunate way, he would have become completely helpless for a long time. Luckily, only a small crack appeared along one of the manipulation lines. As long as Nick focused on fixing that line, his power wouldn't be impacted. For the next couple of minutes, Nick focused on repairing his Specter core and recreated the damaged manipulation line. Within 10 minutes, his power had returned. And then Nick waited. There was nothing else he could do. He couldn't possibly break through any of the walls, and there were no openings except for the tiny maws. Well, Nick could turn into mist and go through them, but that would be suicide. The Maw would probably just kill him. Despite having the power to resist, resisting was often not the most intelligent thing to do. I guess I have to wait for it to gather everyone, Nick thought as he looked at one of the maws on the wall. This should be what the technician told me about, a battle between people that have the Maw's power. Nick moved his hand over one of his blades. Luckily, that shouldn't be much of an issue. The other Extractors will most likely also not have barriers, which means that escape abilities are much more valuable than normal. Humans can take a lot of punishment with their barriers, but without them, we die easily. On top of that, my body is as good as it gets, and I have extensive fighting experience. Nick took a deep breath as he remembered the tongues again. The most dangerous part has already passed. The Maw has accepted me as a participant in its so-called duel. Maybe this is actually a good thing. Yet when Nick thought that, several things shot through his mind. His barrier was destroyed. His space bag was destroyed. He had lost all of his identification. Returning to Aegis might not be as easy as expected. However, I should receive an ability mutation with one of the Eternals. That would make me the only person who ever had access to the abilities of 3 Eternals. The only person Nick knew who had had access to an Eternal was the Champion of Light, since he had the Sun's ability. Maybe the Champion of Light had also been in contact with the Maw before, at which point he would have too. Yet, he couldn't possibly have had access to the Null or the Nightmare. As for Nurse Alice, Nick doubted it. In front of Eternals like her, the Champion of Light wasn't any more significant than an extractor from a random city. Nick didn't think that Nurse Alice would grant her abilities to him. Nick's feelings regarding his current situation were mixed. Logically, this was definitely a positive thing. Yet, the memories of what the tongues had done to him popped into his mind again and again. After a while, Nick shook his head and forced the memories to the back of his mind. This wasn't the first time he had done something like that. Nick knew he had done the same thing after he had released the Crimson Sea. He also felt like this had happened another time before that, but he couldn't remember why or when exactly. That's probably part of the memories I've lost. Over the past years, Nick had learned to deal with his memory loss, but it still felt alien. He remembered times when he had remembered something else, but he didn't remember the specific thing that he remembered. He only knew what kind of feelings he had been roughly feeling back then, but not why. When he tried to remember what had happened, he only felt terror, dissociation, and guilt, but he didn't know why. The number of memories he had lost felt staggering. It only felt like he had forgotten 10% or so, but that 10% was randomly scattered, making it feel like he'd forgotten far more. It was not easy. Nick just pushed the memories of the tongues to the back of his mind and focused on the future. He could deal with these things another time. Sadly, it wasn't so easy. If Nick could occupy himself, this would have been much easier, but he couldn't. He was forced to wait in silence for an unknown period of time. He couldn't learn. He couldn't work. Even more, he couldn't advance right now. Yes, he was essentially surrounded by a Specter, but there was absolutely no Zephyx coming from it. So Nick waited, and while he waited, he kept focusing on the future. Time passed. More time passed. Even more time passed. Nick had no idea how much time had passed, but he was certain that it had to have been at least several days. However, he wasn't sure if it had already been weeks or even months. Time kept passing and passing. Nick had entered a form of trance in which he only looked forward without thinking about anything. There was nothing to think about. He didn't need food, water, air, sleep, or anything similar. He was just there. Finally, Nick felt something change. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he knew that his wait was over. Zephyx, the small maws all over the room gave off Zephyx, filling the room. It wants me to advance, Nick thought as a gleam appeared in his eyes. Nick focused on the Zephyx and willed his Zephyx synchronizer to attune to it. But then, nothing. It didn't attune to the maw. He could feel the Zephyx from the maw, but whenever he took a gulp, he felt like it just went through him. He felt like a skeleton that was trying to drink. My Specter core, Nick realized in horror. My Specter core is isolating my Zephyx synchronizer from any Zephyx. I can't advance. Nick's mind was going wild. They wanted to experiment with ability advancement before he had been taken by the maw. They didn't know yet how Nick could advance his abilities. But I have to, Nick thought with gritted teeth. If he didn't advance, the maw would most likely directly kill him. He needed to get its ability somehow. At that moment, the memories of the tongues shot through his mind again, but this time, he was actually glad that it happened. Nick gritted his teeth, unsheathed his blade, and put it to his neck. Then, he pressed it in. When Nick's blade felt his Specter core, an immense pain shot throughout his body. A moment later, he pushed the blade even further into his neck. Crack! A tiny hole appeared in his Specter core, but it wasn't deep enough yet. He pushed further. Nick felt like he was dying. CRK. Then Nick felt some external Zephyx entering his Zephyx synchronizer. The next moment, he felt it shake. His ability was advancing. Chapter 607, Fusion. Nick's Zephyx synchronizer was attuning to the maw. Sadly, creating a hole in the Specter core could prove disastrous for Nick. Cracking the Specter core with pressure created a fracture that went along one of the manipulation lines, which made it easily repairable. However, breaking through the Specter core via forceful implementation of a blade created a deep cut that didn't go along any manipulation lines. This meant that fixing the manipulation lines after repairing the Specter core wouldn't be as easy. The problem was that trying to break the Specter core the same way the maw had broken it was far too risky. To be frank, the fact that Nick's Zephyx synchronizer didn't break under the maw's forceful grip was sheer luck. It could have easily broken in two, which would have represented Nick's death. On top of that, compressing the Specter core in one's own hands was not easy, and attempting it would have been far too risky. So, he had been forced to use his weapon. Yet that was still far better than being killed by the maw, because he couldn't attune to its ability. As Nick was attuning to the maw, he felt his Specter core repairing. CRK. Nick put his blade back in to keep it from closing up. Simultaneously, he consumed more and more of the Maw's Zephyx. Suddenly, a white light shone out of Nick's neck through the hole that his blade had created. He couldn't see it, but at this moment, white lines were forming on Nick's Zephyx synchronizer. At the same time, Nick felt his muscles shake and his blood boil. Whoom! Then, the Specter core around Nick's Zephyx synchronizer started to shine. Bang! Nick's blade was violently pushed out as the Specter core rapidly closed. For a moment, Nick became panicked, but he quickly realized that the attunement had already been completed. His Zephyx synchronizer was attuned to the Maw. However, Nick wasn't entirely sure what was happening to his Specter core. He focused on it and felt manipulation lines forming. Of course, Nick thought, this is a Specter core, not a blank slate. This means that it is technically an entire Specter. Just like how I am becoming a specialist, the Specter core is becoming a fanatic. But what does that mean for the manipulation lines I've created? Nick thought with anxiety. Would the mutation of the Specter core erase all the hard work of the past years? Nick felt the formation of new manipulation lines and the deletion of old ones. Sure enough, all the old manipulation lines were vanishing. This was bad. The new lines that formed were far less numerous than the ones that had vanished, and Nick felt his Zephyx being thrown into chaos. Nick's entire body shook, and the back of his neck started to shine even brighter. This is not just manipulation lines, Nick realized. His entire Specter core was shining, and Nick felt like he was being encased by molten iron. Everything was hot. It was like his heart was sinking into magma. He even swore that he could hear the sound of sizzling flesh coming from his neck. Pain, agony. It was almost like a hot liquid was slowly becoming solid again. CRK. Burnt flesh fell from Nick's back and neck as new flesh regrew. Nick remained lying on the ground. I'm still alive, he thought in relief. After calming down, Nick slowly stood up. Next, he closed his eyes and focused on his Specter core. Even without looking at it, he could already feel that something fundamental had changed. First of all, Nick felt very different on a base level. Earlier, the foreign Zephyx from the Specter core had felt like a constant pressure or threat to him, but now it was different. The foreign Zephyx was still there, but it didn't feel foreign or alien anymore. Nick felt like the Zephyx was supposed to be there. He felt like this was his Zephyx. As Nick looked closer, he also realized something else. The shock he felt was one of the biggest he had ever experienced in his life. Where's my Zephyx? Nick thought, not being able to come to terms with what he was witnessing. There was no human Zephyx inside of him. Nothing. Nick quickly checked his Zephosis cycle. Nothing. He was not undergoing Zephosis at this moment. Yet he felt full of power. But how was that possible without Zephosis? Without it, veterans and stronger couldn't survive since their vital functions used up more energy than nutrition and oxygen could provide. A shocking thought appeared in Nick's mind. I don't need nutrition or oxygen anymore, he thought slowly. I am essentially a walking corpse, or... Nick almost didn't dare consider that possibility. A Specter. Silence. I can't jump to conclusions, Nick thought with urgency as he narrowed his eyes. I have to test this. The next moment, Nick looked at his left hand. Xing. He unsheathed his blade and cut one of his fingers off. Nick gritted his teeth and watched his severed finger fall to the ground. And as he continued watching, more and more pressure built inside of his head. His finger, it was turning into black mist. This was not how human bodies acted. This was how Specter bodies acted. Nick looked at the stump on his left hand. Then, he saw a black pillar growing out of it before it changed colors and form to become Nick's finger again. Silence. This was undeniable proof. This was no longer a human body. Nick gritted his teeth. CRK. A moment later, he made a hole in his Specter core again. Nick went deeper and deeper until, eventually. CRK. The tip of the blade came out of the other side. Nick's perception was reeling, and it was difficult for him to remain conscious due to the damage, but he forced himself to stay awake. Finally, he pulled his blade out. Nothing. There's no Zephyx synchronizer, Nick realized as his perception entered his Specter core. It was empty or, from another point of view, solid. The fact was that there was no Zephyx synchronizer in the middle. There was only a Specter core. At that moment, Nick took note of his surroundings, or more accurately, the things lying around him. Flesh, pieces of a human body, his human body. Nick could even see his own head and his own eyes lying on the ground. The human body was not in one piece. It looked more like the molt of an insect, like something had crawled out of the body's back and cast the old body off like trash. Nick felt a profound feeling of alienation. This was not him. He was not Nick. Who was he? What was he? Nick's mind panicked, and his emotions were going wild. Emotions? Nick thought at that moment. Specters don't have emotions, right? Nick focused on his own emotions. Were these emotions? The more he focused on them, the more distant and artificial they felt. Was he actually feeling what he was thinking he was feeling? How could he tell whether or not his emotions were real? As Nick asked himself these questions, he calmed down. It was like the storm in Nick's mind had moved to the back. So these were not emotions. And yet the storm of emotions was still there. It was just in the back of Nick's mind. It had not completely vanished. They were just very dulled. The storm of emotions in the background calmed down a little as Nick realized something. This is not a complete transformation, he thought. This is not a complete takeover of my old Specter core. My old Specter core did not completely consume and annex my Zephyx synchronizer. Chapter 608, Surreal Environment. As soon as the hole appeared in the walls surrounding Nick started to enclose him, forcing him out of the room. Naturally, Nick quickly jumped out and looked through his surroundings. It was like Nick was inside some kind of surrealist painting. He wasn't in some kind of room or hallway. It was more like a surreal cavern. There were almost no paths or streets, just vertical, horizontal, and diagonal columns made of flesh and eyes. Nick was on top of a horizontal fleshy column that went from one wide vertical column to another. When he looked over the edge, he saw more columns randomly placed everywhere. The same pattern seemed to endlessly continue downward, upward, and sideward. It was just chaos. The furthest Nick could see was 150 meters in one direction before that one was blocked by a column as well. Finally, the columns were not static. They pulsed. The eyes moved. Even the columns themselves became wider and thinner at random intervals. Sometimes, new columns were made while old ones vanished. Everything was alive. Nick felt like he was inside one gigantic organism of untold power and proportions. How big was the maw? Nobody knew. They only knew that it had to be absolutely gigantic. And sure enough, Nick could confirm that it was humongous. Nick's mind was still reeling from his revelation that he now apparently was a Specter. What about his future? Would he be humanity's enemy? Could he use a barrier? What would he just do if they found out? How could he prove that he was human or had been, when there were so many Specters that were amazing at acting like one? Nick's mind was filled with doubts, uncertainties, and fears. Finally, he shook his head. I can't think about this right now, he thought with gritted teeth as he pushed his worries into the back of his mind. The Maw's contest has already started, and the others are already searching for their opponents, most likely. I can think about my future after getting out of here. An instant later, Nick turned into mist. Since the Maw's eyes were illuminating his surroundings, he couldn't become ethereal or fly normally. On top of that, the Maw's eyes were constantly keeping watch over him. Sadly, Nick would most likely not be able to use his main ability during this entire competition. His blinding light definitely wasn't strong enough to blind the Maw, and his new ability from upgrading his mist ability also wouldn't help much. Naturally, this gave Nick a huge disadvantage in this competition. However, not everything was bad. Since this was not open terrain, and since no contestant had a barrier, assassins were naturally favored, and Nick was exactly that. There was plenty of confusing terrain that worked as escape routes and ambushes. Additionally, every competitor was an initial specialist, and Nick doubted that any of them had a depth of fighting experience that could rival him. Nick wasn't the biggest fan of killing innocent humans, but he was forced to. He would not sacrifice his life for only one guy. Nick was not opposed to sacrificing his life for others, but his sacrifice needed to have a purpose. The mist that was Nick flowed along the pillars and carefully navigated the confusing environment. While he was doing so, his perception covered his surroundings in detail. Since his Zephyx synchronizer had fused with his Specter core, there were no more issues regarding his abilities. This meant that Nick could use his newest ability as well, the one he had gotten from the Maw. Sadly, as with most of his abilities, its true power could only be exhibited if no one was perceiving him. Luckily, it still had a minor effect while being perceived, making it not completely useless in this environment. The sheer power of an Eternal made them useful in basically every category. The Nightmare could manipulate, torture, scare, stun, kill, sense, and so on. Therefore, if somebody advanced their ability with the Nightmare's help, there was a very high likelihood that the Nightmare's ability had a high compatibility rating with the Extractor's base ability. The Maw was the same. It could extend towards great distances, was physically extremely powerful, had powerful sensing abilities, could suppress people, could vanish from seemingly any spot, and so on. Because of that, the diversity of abilities the Maw could grant people was crazy. Naturally, the Maw had advanced Nick's ability in the most useful way for him. Sensing. Nick had plenty of ways to escape and stay hidden, but his sensing abilities were not that great. Yes, he could feel whether or not somebody was perceiving him, but that was still rather limited. The ability the Maw had given Nick was as simple as it was effective. It passively increased the sensitivity of all of his senses. Nick's vision was stronger, he could hear better, his sensitivity to Zephyx was higher, and he could feel vibrations much more strongly. The sensitivity of his senses could be compared to the senses of a hero, and that was only the passive effect. Naturally, there was also an active ability Nick had gained, but he could only use it while not being perceived, making it useless in the current environment. In his mist form, Nick continued to move forward, continually scanning his surroundings. I have no idea how big the arena is, but it can't be too big. After all, the Maw is doing this mainly to gain Zephyx. Entertainment is only secondary. Several minutes passed, yet Nick hadn't found anyone else. That's unusual, he thought. With my powerful senses, I should be able to find at least one of them, but I didn't. Additionally, I've already traveled several kilometers in here. I believe I should have come across someone already, so why didn't I? Either the arena is much bigger than I thought, or everyone else is extremely good at hiding, or I just have bad luck. Nevertheless, I should continue searching. Nick kept moving across different columns, scanning all of them for any hidden enemies. I don't think there are more than 8 contestants. If there were more, I would have found one already. More minutes passed, still nothing. Nick's mood became more solemn. What is going on? There are supposed to be enemies, right? Even if every enemy is an assassin or runner, I should have seen one already. With my newly improved senses, not many specialists should be able to hide from me. CLK. At that moment, Nick heard a very subtle sound. Without his improved senses, he would not have been able to pick it up. Nick carefully but quickly slithered towards the origin of the sound. Finally, he found it. Another competitor. On a horizontal pillar about 20 meters below Nick was a woman with black eyes, black hair, and 2 black daggers. Just as Nick had expected, the Maw had also destroyed all of her belongings, including barrier and clothes. Just like Nick, she was armed and naked. I don't feel any Zephyx coming from her, Nick thought as he took a close look at her. That's probably one of her abilities. She has to be an assassin. The woman slowly moved around the pillars, sticking to them like a spider. Nick moved after her. Everyone else had to die anyway for Nick to escape. The woman was moving with impressive subtlety, and if Nick hadn't heard that noise earlier, he wouldn't have found her. It was extremely difficult to perceive her for some reason, since she seemingly didn't give off any Zephyx. It was almost like she was just an illusion or an afterimage. Very impressive ability. Nick closed in on her. He was extremely careful. She stopped for a moment to look past one of the pillars. Bang! Nick transformed into his physical form, unsheathed his blades, and rammed one through her head. Her expression changed to terror, but there was nothing else she could do. One down, Nick thought. Nick pulled his blade out. The corpse fell forward. Crack! And split apart into sheets of flesh and eyes. Nick's eyes widened. That was not a human body. In an instant, Nick could tell that this sheet of flesh and eyes looked exactly like the Maw, but without its unnerving and impossible power. This was the ability of an extractor. This had to be the ability the extractor had received from the Maw, a flesh clone. This was a trap. Bang! Yet before Nick could react, a dagger came out of his forehead. The same woman from earlier had reappeared, and she had buried her dagger in Nick's head. This was a huge miscalculation. Nick's opponent was not an initial specialist. It was an initial hero. Xiang. And then a second dagger cut Nick's head off. Chapter 609. There was a mistake. Nick's head hit the pillar they were standing on and tumbled down. While it was falling, it turned into black ash. When the hero saw that, her eyes widened. Bang! Yet just like Nick, she couldn't react in time, and his blade rammed into her chest. Bang! The next instant, both of them jumped away from each other. The woman was still shocked at what she had seen and tried to gain some distance, while Nick didn't have access to his sight or hearing, putting him at a severe disadvantage. Within a second, Nick's head regrew and he focused on his enemy, but he didn't attack yet. In fact, Nick was still reeling with shock about all of the revelations. I lost my head, Nick thought in shock. She cut my head off. Nick's brain had been penetrated, he had felt it. However, his ability to think had not been compromised despite his brain essentially getting scrambled. That was because he was a Specter. His entire existence was concentrated on his Specter core. Losing his head used up a lot of his Zephyx and temporarily took away his senses, but it wasn't deadly. When he had lost his head, Nick had felt like he had lost contact with his eyes and ears. It had been an extremely weird and alien feeling. Luckily, his Specter core was at the base of his neck, and the hero had cut off Nick's head near the middle to the top of his neck. Yet this wasn't the only thing Nick was shocked about. She's a hero, why is there a hero here? Nick thought. Nick's mind was going wild with theories. It should have been impossible for heroes to be in this contest. Sadly, the fact that the other contestants were heroes explained some of Nick's doubts. For example, why he hadn't seen any other contestant until now. Heroes were much better at hiding themselves, and even with Nick's advanced senses, it wouldn't be easy to find them. It would also explain why his current opponent had managed to hit him with such a quick and devastating hit. She was several times stronger than Nick. Nevertheless, this changed everything. Nick was confident in being able to kill 7 initial specialists, even without access to his abilities. However, the same thing wasn't true for heroes. But why were heroes here in the first place? Unfortunately, Nick didn't have the time to think about these things right now. The two of them were almost 50 meters away from each other, but for a hero, these 50 meters might as well be within arm's reach. For a moment, the two of them looked at each other with narrowed eyes. Naturally, the hero was just as confused and shocked as Nick. What was a fanatic doing here? They only looked at each other for a single second, but it felt like a full minute to them. Both of them were planning. There were very unusual circumstances. That was when Nick noticed something, and he had to make a split-second decision. Nick looked deeply into the hero's eyes. Then, he quickly glanced to a place behind her before looking back into her eyes with intensity. Now, the hero had to make a split-second decision. Boom! The hero dodged to the side as a bullet shot past her old location. Bang! The bullet hit one of the eyes on the columns and was turned into a flat sheet of metal. Naturally, Nick noticed the sniper and warned her about them. A person with a red cloak materialized. Compared to Nick and the woman, he wasn't naked, but it was also clear that the red cloak wasn't any kind of normal clothing. This was probably part of their ability. Chase. A whisper filled with Zephyx reached Nick's ears. The voice was female, and it was clear that the whisper had come from the black-haired woman. Nick narrowed his eyes and charged towards the sniper. The sniper jumped backward and pulled out a handgun. Nick could see the hate-filled eyes of the attacker. It wasn't surprising that the attacker was angry. This was a free-for-all, and one less opponent represented a higher chance of survival. Nobody would have warned the woman of the attack under normal circumstances since nobody else could survive anyway. By letting the sniper kill her, Nick would have a higher likelihood of winning. Warning her would make no sense. That was why the sniper was so angry. He was angry at Nick's idiocy. Of course, he didn't know why Nick had done so. The woman was the only one who knew that Nick was a Specter, and she was also the only one he could talk with because of that. In this contest, being human is more dangerous than being a Specter. Humans had an incentive to kill each other in here, but what about a Specter? Additionally, the woman and Nick had already clashed with each other, and both of them had survived. This made both of them extremely dangerous to the other, since the other one had managed to survive one of their ambushes already, unveiling a big part of their powers. Clashing again was a very bad idea since there was no way it would end with one side easily overwhelming the other. No, a battle between them would cost both sides dearly, which was why postponing it to the end made more sense. Nick charged forward while zigzagging to avoid getting hit. At that moment, the sniper's eyes turned into teeth-filled maws. CRK. A maw extended from the column below Nick and bit his ankle. Nick's charge was halted immediately. Bang! The sniper shot. Bang! Nick's head exploded. Almost immediately, the sniper jumped backward and aimed their gun to his left. The black-haired woman materialized in front of the sniper and slashed forward with her dagger. Bang! The sniper shot with his small gun, hitting one of the woman's daggers and shooting it out of her damaged hand. Shing! The other dagger moved forward and sliced the sniper's hand off, together with their smaller gun. Whoom! At that moment, the red cloak moved forward on its own and covered the black-haired woman. The sniper was revealed to be a skinny man with red hair. With his free hand, he pulled up his rifle. He didn't need 2 hands to fire it. Don't kill him, the woman inside the red cloak transmitted to everyone around her. The man fired. CRK. But he missed his shot as his other arm was suddenly cut off by a blade. The man's eyes widened in terror as he saw the half-headed figure beside him. Nick's head was still regrowing. Shing! The red cloak was torn apart by the remaining dagger. At the same time, Nick jumped away from the man, who was too shocked by the loss of both of his hands and seeing Nick alive with half a head to react in time. Xiang. The woman's dagger entered the man's forehead and killed him. Wum. At the same time, a ton of Zephyx exploded out of the man's body. The eyes on the columns turned into maws, which then proceeded to suck the Zephyx out of the battleground. Yet, the maws also extended toward the woman. Nick started to feel something coming off her. This was Zephyx, but it was a weird kind he had never felt before, exactly the kind that the maw was absorbing from her. Nick immediately realized several things. Just as I have saved her life earlier, she has saved my life. I nearly killed myself just now. Too conspicuous, the woman transmitted before jumping away. Follow. Nick did just that. He turned into mist and floated after her. She had already seen that Nick could turn into mist. There was no point in trying to keep it secret. The two of them rapidly but silently moved away from the battleground before stopping between two pillars. There was no line of sight between them since they were separated by a pillar, but that was exactly what they wanted. Being the first one to poke around a pillar was a disadvantage, and neither of them would want to risk that against such a powerful opponent. You realize that you nearly died just now? The woman asked with a serious voice. I do now, Nick answered. Why are you here? She asked. Nick couldn't immediately answer. She would never believe him if he said that he used to be human just a couple of minutes ago. Even more, this would take minutes if not hours to explain properly. While they could have a quick conversation, they didn't have the time for such a long one. There was a mistake. I'm not supposed to be here, Nick said. I just want to get out of here. We can both get out of here, she said. I realized. Cooperation, she asked. Cooperation, Nick agreed. The reason why Nick had nearly died earlier was because he was not human. Therefore, killing another human in this place would not fulfill the Maw's criteria for growing stronger. Nick would not release the special kind of Zephyx that the Maw had absorbed earlier. This meant ruining the Maw's meal, and that would have meant Nick's death. In short, Nick was not allowed to kill anyone in this contest. Chapter 610, Middle. Nick and the hero were both very experienced people, and they could convey a lot of information with just a few words. Talking for a long period was dangerous since there were other heroes present as well, and it was important that they remained as inconspicuous as possible. After just exchanging these couple of words, the two of them stopped talking. They didn't need to talk more for now. Both sides had a solid reason for cooperation. Nick couldn't kill any human since that would just make them all kill him, and the hero couldn't afford to kill Nick since his death would have no benefit but a lot of risk. Because of that, a unique team between a human and a Specter was created. Nick had several more questions, but gaining the answers wasn't worth the risk of being exposed. Sadly, that meant Nick couldn't find an answer to these questions immediately. However, he didn't need to ask all of the questions to find some of the answers. Sometimes, a little time to ponder was enough to solve some riddles. The Maw offered me its Zephyx, which means that this is not just a casual competition but a competition between Extractors with the Maw's ability. The woman and the sniper also used abilities that showed a strong influence from the Maw. I'm an initial specialist, or fanatic, and they are initial heroes. So logically, the Maw must think that I am just like them, a peak specialist who has advanced to become an initial hero. But why? Nick thought back to the tongues. Thinking about them still made his skin crawl. Then he realized something. I had about 3 times the Zephyx of a normal peak expert. Additionally, my body was very athletic and powerful. My Zephyx regeneration was also unmatched. My raw power was on the level of an early specialist already. But the Maw knew that I was ready for ability advancement, which meant I had to be at the peak of a level. The two closest levels are peak expert and peak specialist. Judging by my powers, I was either the strongest peak expert it has ever seen or the weakest peak specialist. I guess, in the end, it decided that I was the weakest peak specialist and sent me here. Maybe that also explains why I had to wait for so long. There should be several times more peak experts than peak specialists. Finally, Nick could somewhat paint a picture of his current situation. However, there was still something muddy and hard to grasp. This is how I got here, but what about my actual situation right now? I'm not sure if there ever was a Specter inside one of the Maw's competitions. How am I supposed to act? What will happen to me? Nick was a definite irregularity here, and he had no idea how the Maw would take his presence. The Maw was not very intelligent. So much was clear. It was more of an organism of instinct. It was like an insect. The Maw was currently digesting its prey, and it had swallowed something that it couldn't digest. It was obviously trying to digest this indigestible thing by using the same methods it used to digest the other things. What would an organism do if it realized that it couldn't digest something? That depended on what the indigestible thing did. If I do absolutely nothing and leave when the first opportunity presents itself, the maw should ignore me. I have not done any damage. I will just be pooped out. But if I start damaging things or interrupting its digestion, I will be seen as a poison or a parasite. It would then attack and kill me. I might have a shot at escaping if only one human remains and gets transported out. I just have to follow them to the outside and things will be fine. Now the two of them could see each other and they were slowly and stealthily traveling along some columns. Nick threw a quick glance at the hero. She's my ticket out. She knows me, and she has no reason to kill me while we are inside. She also wouldn't want to cause any unnecessary trouble while she's leaving the mall. Of course, things might change after we leave, but that's a different issue altogether. For now, I'm stuck with her. Naturally, the hero also tried to analyze the situation. She had never heard of the mall consuming specters. Was this specter some kind of parasite? Was something like that even possible? Could specters feed on other specters? The hero had no idea why Nick was here, but she knew that he couldn't kill her. Ironically, the hero was being protected from a specter by a stronger specter. The two of them slowly crept forward, searching for their enemy. CRRRK. At that point, the columns started to make noise, and they were pulling together. The two of them rapidly moved towards a direction that was not being compressed by the columns. It was clear what was happening. The maw was compressing the fighting arena. It didn't want to wait forever for its food to be digested. The two of them kept moving away from the compressing walls until they no longer closed in on each other. They did not know by how much the fighting arena had been shrunk, but it had to be a lot. Nick looked away from the compressed walls before traveling alongside them for a bit. The angle of the compressed walls made a circle, and Nick could quickly calculate the sphere's dimensions with some math. It's about 300 meters in diameter, Nick thought. The fighting arena was a sphere with a diameter of 300 meters, filled with columns and pillars. This made the fighting arena almost claustrophobic for such powerful fighters. An initial hero could travel several kilometers per second. Such a small arena was similar to putting two adult men into a small closet as a fighting arena. The senses of the heroes were also fine enough that they could feel other heroes from around 150 meters away, unless the other hero was outstanding in staying hidden. There was no doubt that they would meet the remaining contestants soon. In total, there should be 8 contestants. I was 1, but don't count any more, making it 7. My ally is not my enemy, making it 6. We have killed 1 already, making it 5. 5 is the maximum possible number of enemies left, but that's assuming that nobody else has battled within the last minutes. Anything from 1 to 5 enemies are left. Nick furrowed his brows. Take advantage of your nature, the female hero transmitted to Nick. That was not the first time she had done this. The ability to transmit one's voice was not easy to learn, even for heroes. I wonder what her background is. Nick nodded. He knew what she meant. It was risky, but battles like this were always risky. Nick jumped forward and landed on a column. He was not loudly announcing himself with the jump, but he also wasn't trying to stay hidden. Any hero close to Nick must have heard him. Naturally, that was the plan. Nick had to take advantage of the fact that he was a Specter and that nobody knew that he was one. Then he just waited. Nothing. Silence. Nick had even lost track of his ally. His senses were extraordinary, but these were heroes. There was probably not a single hero younger than 100 years old. These were the most talented 0.0001% or so, and they had over a century of experience. It was not easy for Nick to compete with these kinds of people without access to his main abilities. Even heroes who did not count as runners, assassins, or snipers were amazing at staying hidden. Nick waited. Nothing. Yet he was certain that at least one enemy must have heard him. Seconds passed. Nick still waited. He became more nervous, but the nervousness was accompanied by bewilderment, confusion, and dissociation. Do I really feel nervous? Is this real? Am I feeling this, or am I just deluding myself into thinking that I'm feeling this? Are these emotions real or not? Nick felt like he was looking at himself from an external perspective. He just saw himself standing on a column, waiting. Except for the squelching noise of the pulsing walls, everything was silent. He waited. Then Nick jumped to another column. He did not land quietly. It was impossible that no one noticed him. He waited again. He jumped another time. Those had been 3 long jumps, and Nick believed that he was very close to the center of the arena now. Every single hero in the arena must have noticed him by now. But nothing was happening. Nick did not find anyone. He didn't even find his ally. It was like he was alone. So he waited and waited. Chapter 611, Schemes Upon Schemes. Am I this scary? Nick asked after waiting for over 30 seconds in the middle of the arena. Naturally, nobody answered him. There was just silence. Nick looked around the arena but couldn't find anyone. They were definitely good at staying hidden. Without access to most of his abilities, Nick really was out of his element here. Fighting a hero was already hard enough with his abilities. Is it so hard to believe that I would actually do something like this? Nick asked. Do you think this has to be some kind of trap? Yet nobody did anything. I already killed one guy, and that was several minutes ago before the arena compressed like this. Nick spoke evenly. Most likely, the arena compressed after half of the contestants were killed, so there are probably 4 left including me. Naturally, nobody answered him, which was funny since there was no doubt that every single combatant in the arena had heard him. Are you circling around me? Nick asked. Are you guys all trying to search for each other first? The first person that attacks me opens themselves up to an attack from the others and nobody wants to go first. You can kill me, but you will be next. Is that it? No answer. All right, let's switch things up, Nick said. The first person I see will be my ally and we will kill the other 2. After that, we can fight each other. How does that sound? Silence. Nick couldn't tell what the combatants were thinking about. Most likely, they were all stalking around Nick. They all knew that everyone else had to be close to this place as well, and they were probably circling him, trying to find each other first. That includes the one that gets attacked first, by the way, Nick said evenly. If I see a battle starting, I will jump to the aid of the attacked one. Silence. There was no change in Nick's surroundings, but this sentence had to have an effect. Now, stalking and attacking somebody else was a bad idea. The female hero was a bit perplexed by Nick as she snuck around his general area. This was a very strange Specter. Nick looked around. Ding! At that moment, Nick saw a tiny red light appearing for just a moment. Found my partner, Nick said. Whoom! Then Nick exploded with light and jumped towards the red light. Sadly, his ability didn't activate since he couldn't blind them all, but he was sure that he had blinded the heroes. Nick arrived almost instantly at the place where he had seen the red light. On top of the fleshy column, his eyes saw a short message written in blood. Man spear ally. Bang! Nick kicked the message, destroying it. I got your message, Nick said. Nick didn't see any movement, but he was sure that the other heroes were currently scrambling. After getting blinded, they were most likely running around trying to get the drop on one of the others. Yet nothing seemingly changed, but that couldn't be further from the truth. From the most dangerous position, Nick had moved to the safest. The other heroes knew that Nick now had an ally. Additionally, Nick secretly had another ally, the female hero. If there were truly only 4 people left, Nick would be allied with 2 of them. Then it was time to get back to waiting. Earlier, Nick had been in the most danger, but now he was in the least. Only one enemy was not Nick's ally, and that person knew that Nick's ally would attack them if they attacked Nick. This meant that Nick could walk around without needing to hide. He was safe, for the moment. Bang! Someone had just attacked somebody else. This was the signal for the final battle. Naturally, everyone immediately went to that place. Nick noticed a figure splitting into several maws. Someone had just attacked the female hero's flesh clone. By the looks of things, her clone had been killed by a spear. Nick immediately found the attacker. It was a naked man holding a spear surrounded by darkness. In an instant, their eyes met. Their gazes only conveyed a single word. Ally. Nick's hands moved. 2 of his fingers moved over his eyes while his other hand gestured for the guy to approach. The man understood. Whoom! Nick exploded into light. Meanwhile, the man closed his eyes and jumped towards Nick. At that moment, Nick saw a black glint a bit behind the man, the female hero from earlier. Nick jumped towards the man with the spear. Follow, he ordered with a whisper just loud enough to hear. The man clenched his right hand around his spear nervously. Nick was dangerously close right now, and he was jumping past him. From such a distance, any attack could be fatal. The man had to make a split-second decision. In the end, he decided against attacking Nick. And then Nick flew past the man. The man's nerves calmed down. He had gambled correctly. He turned around and flew after Nick, who was chasing seemingly nothing. After several turns, the man finally saw the shadow Nick was running after. He overtook Nick and closed in on the shadow. Bang! He attacked, and the shadow expanded before evading to the side. This was obviously some kind of ability that the female hero could use. At that moment, Nick arrived in front of the shadow. His right arm flickered for just an instant, and then he stabbed forward with his right hand. Two daggers came out of the shadow and blocked his blade, but the power still threw the owner of the daggers to the side. Naturally, Nick had warned her about his upcoming attack. To every onlooker, it looked like Nick had thrown the attacker into the distance. Everyone believed that Nick was an initial hero, and they could also see his impressive body. Receiving an attack from somebody like that had to be brutal. Bang! A gunshot. A fourth person had appeared, and they had shot a gun at the man with the spear. However, the man had been prepared, and before the bullet could hit him, a maw appeared between him and the bullet. The bullet was swallowed, and some Zephyx left the man's body. Naturally, since there were only 4 people left, the last person realized that if they didn't intervene, the spear man and Nick would kill the dagger woman. Then, it would be 2 versus 1. So, he had to intervene right now and help the dagger woman against her 2 attackers. "You deal with him, I deal with the daggers," Nick shouted to the spear man. "Don't drag me down," the man with the spear shouted back. Nick hadn't stopped charging after the female hero. The two exchanged a short glance. There was one more thing that the two of them knew that the others didn't. The female hero moved her fingers rapidly to convey a message to Nick. By time, Nick thought. That was what the gestures meant. However, Nick could tell what the actual message was. The fact that they were allies was not the only secret. Nick quickly reached the female hero and attacked her with his blades again, throwing her into the distance. His attack looked brutal, but it wasn't that bad. The female hero could deal with this. As she flew back, her eyes looked back at Nick. At that moment, he saw an urgent glint in them, and he knew what was about to happen. Bang! A long sword entered the back of Nick's head and came out of the front. His entire brain was scrambled yet again. A 5th combatant. CRK. At that moment, Nick turned around, destroying a huge part of his head, and wrapped his arms and legs around the attacker behind him. The eyes of the attacker opened wide in shock. How? He should be dead. He destroyed his head. Xiang. The next moment, a dagger entered the man's forehead. Their plan had worked. The secret that the two of them knew was that there had to be a 5th person here. After all, Nick was a Specter and didn't count as a combatant. So, there were 4 humans and a Specter. Naturally, when the last person saw 4 people in front of him, he realized that he was in the best position right now since nobody believed he would be there. Originally, he planned on staying hidden. But then, he had seen the subtle gestures that the female hero performed to communicate with Nick. This guy was actually a secret ally to the female hero. At that moment, he realized that he would have to fight a team, no matter who won. He saw that Nick was the key and realized that he had to get rid of him. Only then would it become a free-for-all again. And that was exactly what Nick and the female hero had planned. After all, why would she purposefully use gestures to communicate when she could just transmit commands to Nick via voice message? It was to show that she was Nick's ally to the last person. Chapter 612, End of Contest. Nick quickly jumped away from the corpse while several maws appeared all over the walls to consume the Zephyx. Nick's head was rapidly healing, and after it recovered, he turned into mist. At the same time, the female hero vanished into thin air. Nick could still feel and hear the explosions of the other battle, and he knew that they were relatively far away. They did not have vision of Nick's battle, which was perfect. Since the 5th person had been killed just now, Zephyx had been released, and if either of the other 2 felt it, they would know that somebody had just died. After the woman vanished, Nick slithered over towards the other battle. A couple of seconds later, he arrived. Both combatants were already quite injured, but that didn't say a lot. Heroes could recover very quickly. Only Zephyx mattered. The two kept fighting while Nick watched. "Don't go back on your word," the man with the spear shouted at Nick. Nick turned into his solid form again and just looked at their battle. At that moment, the battle paused, and the two of them looked at each other with urgency. They knew that Nick had killed the hero with the daggers, and they could also tell that he wasn't very exhausted. If they continued fighting, the winner would need to fight a fully recovered Nick. That was bad for both of them. Maybe it was for the better to ally for now and attack Nick. "Fine," Nick said at that point. Bang! Nick exploded with light, but this time, the two of them were ready for that. They closed their eyes for just an instant before opening them again. The man with the spear saw Nick charging at the man with the gun, who was readying his gun to shoot Nick down. Bang! The man shot, but Nick turned into smoke, dodged the projectile, and closed in on him. The man with the gun seemed worried. Nick arrived in front of him. At that point, the eyes of the man with the spear shone. Darkness gathered around his weapon, and he struck forward. He would kill Nick just when he would kill the man with the gun. CRK. Nick struck and buried his blade in the man's head. Boom! The powerful spear broke through Nick's torso, making his entire body explode. Then, it continued and also turned the other man's body into powder. At that moment his eyes widened. He did it, he won, he. Bang! A gunshot ended the man's thoughts forever. The man with the gun was about 30 meters away and looked at the man with the spear with a mix of betrayal, shock, and hatred. This idiot. They were supposed to ally against Nick, but this guy just randomly attacked him with his spear after the light blast. Luckily, the attack had seemed rather sloppy, and the man with the gun managed to dodge. So what happened? Nick had made it seem like he was charging towards the man with the gun when in reality he hid behind the pillar he had just stood on. After using his light explosion and the two of them closing their eyes, he manipulated the perception of the man with the spear. The man thought he was attacking Nick, but in truth, he was attacking the man with the gun. Naturally, the man with the gun could see the attack and dodged. In his anger at being betrayed, he shot at the man with the spear, who died instantly. After the man killed the other man, his mind slowly began noticing that something was wrong. That attack was too stupid and too sudden. Additionally, the attack had been rather sloppy. The spearman had not managed to avoid his shot when he had managed to do so several times already. However, his train of thought was quickly interrupted as Nick charged at him. Nick had used a ton of Zephyx, manipulating the other man's perception for just those short moments, and he was basically close to empty. The man with the gun didn't have it any easier. His prolonged duel with the spearman had taken a huge toll on him. Whoom! Nick turned into mist as he moved towards the man with the gun, who aimed at him. Shing! And then, a dagger went through his head as the woman reappeared behind him. Nick turned back into his physical form and stood on top of a column as he looked at the woman. That should be it. Every other human had died. The moths appeared all over the walls again, but the woman kept focusing on Nick. At this moment, she realized that she had severely underestimated this fanatic. This fanatic had essentially killed a hero. It might not have dealt the killing blow, but it had managed to indirectly kill one. Nick looked at her and saw her expression. "I will explain everything to you when we are outside," Nick said. "As long as you don't attack me, we are not enemies." The woman looked at Nick with narrowed eyes without saying anything. Eventually, the moths vanished. Then the two of them waited. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Nick looked at the ceiling. CRRR. Suddenly, the surroundings started to compress again. The walls were closing in, and the columns and pillars were vanishing into them. The two of them moved towards the middle of the arena. A couple seconds later, the walls stopped compressing, and the two of them were left in a space that was about 4 meters wide. Naturally, neither of them was happy about this. From this distance, killing the other one was extremely easy. They just looked at each other with wariness. The woman was at a definite advantage. Their alliance was already shaky. The only reason why she didn't attack yet is that she's afraid of my power, Nick thought. If Nick killed her, the Maw would most likely kill him, but if she killed Nick, nothing would happen to her. If it were easy to kill him, she would have probably already done so. 10 seconds passed. Whoom! And then the ceiling opened. "Let me go first," Nick said before jumping from wall to move upward. The woman looked at Nick with narrowed eyes and flew after him. The opening of the tunnel represented relative safety to Nick. Earlier, they couldn't have been certain if the Maw wanted them to fight or not. But with the open tunnel, things became clear that the Maw was letting the human go. And the last thing a human would want to do in this scenario was to aggravate or anger the Maw any further. If she launched an attack and missed Nick, the Maw might view that as an attack of its own. The two of them continued to fly upward for several kilometers. Eventually, the covert light of the fleshy walls gave way to the actual light of the sun. Nick jumped out of the Maw. The woman jumped after him. The two of them found themselves in a mountainous area, with the sun shining brightly above them. Just like everywhere else on the planet, everything looked like a wasteland. The mountains were gray, brown, and beige. Nick quickly landed on the ground. For the entire time, he had been looking at the female hero. Naturally, she had come out behind him, and she was also looking at Nick. A moment later, the Maw on one of the mountains vanished. Finally, Nick was no longer under constant supervision. As long as he blinded her, he could unleash his true power. However, "I'm ready to talk now," Nick said. She was not his enemy. The woman kept her eyes narrowed. "What's there to talk about with a Specter?" she asked. I'm not really a Specter. At least, not in the way you think, Nick said. I'm not your enemy and I'm willing to explain everything. The hero looked at Nick with furrowed brows. She didn't answer. My name is Nick Dusk, Nick said, and I am or used to be human. The woman raised an eyebrow. Nick told her about his consumption and what had happened with his Zephyx synchronizer. Then, he told her about his experiments with the technician and about what had happened to him when he advanced a level. That's why I was in there, Nick said. The Maw thought that I was the weakest peak specialist when, in fact, I was the strongest peak expert. The woman just looked at Nick for a while. This sounded insanely convoluted. Additionally, Nick was saying things that she couldn't even verify since she didn't have a barrier to check things. Prove it, she demanded after a while. How, Nick asked. If your so-called mutation only occurred after you received the Maw's ability, show me the ability you received from it. All the abilities the Maw has granted have its distinct appearance. Show me an ability that includes the Maw's appearance and I will believe you. Silence. I have one, Nick said, but I can't show you. Sadly, Nick could only use his new active ability if nobody was perceiving him. The woman just looked at him coldly. Pity. Chapter 613, No Human. How was Nick supposed to prove that he wasn't lying? He didn't have a barrier. He didn't have human Zephyx. There were no other people around who knew him. You just have to ask Aegis, Nick said with a careful voice. Tell them that you found Nick Dusk. They saw me getting taken by the Maw. The woman didn't look like she believed him and just kept looking at him with a serious expression. Fine, I will do just that, she said. I don't believe that you are telling the truth, but I'm willing to try at least. Nick did not calm down. He could hear that she was about to add a but. But I can't let a Specter run around just like that. If you come peacefully, I will ask Aegis about you, she said. Nick became more nervous. Come peacefully. She will put me in a containment unit, he thought. In the past, containment units were interesting to Nick, and he also associated them with growth. After all, he became more powerful while working with Specters that were inside containment units. But now, things were very different. If Nick was put in a containment unit, he would never be released again. If this hero just dumped him in a random containment unit in a random city, nobody from Aegis would be able to find him. Aegis didn't know that Nick was now a Specter, which meant that they would not ask the cities to check their containment units for somebody called Nick Dusk. Additionally, there would probably be tens of Specters that would claim to be Nick Dusk anyway. Voluntarily entering a containment unit represented losing control over his own life. The only thing he could rely on would be the hero's word, and humans were generally not the most trustworthy beings, especially when they were powerful. I can't bet my life on your word alone, Nick said. If I'm put in a containment unit, there is no way that Aegis will find me. The hero frowned. I told you that I will tell them. Are you saying I'm a liar? She asked with annoyance. I don't know if you are a liar or not, Nick answered. I don't know anything about you. If I were human, would you put your life in my hands just because I say that I won't kill you? She didn't immediately answer. But you're not human, she said after a bit. You are a Specter, and Specters are only interested in their own gain. You mean like the majority of humans? Nick asked. Wrong, the woman shouted, her voice angrier than before. There are many powerful humans who want to improve humanity. There are some humans that act like Specters, but the most powerful humans only want what's best for humanity. Aegis' existence disproves your claim. Nick felt a strange feeling. The way the hero argued reminded him of himself. This sounded very much like what he used to say. Was she wrong, though? No, what she said was the truth. While many humans were greedy, humans also had the capacity to be good. As she said, Aegis' existence was the best proof. Are you a bailiff? Nick asked. You sound like somebody that went through the trainee program. The hero's expression intensified. What do you know about the trainee program? A lot, Nick said. I used to be part of it until just a couple of years ago. After that, Nick told her about the Specters, the levels, the practical experience, and so on. The hero looked at him with intensity, and Nick couldn't be sure what she was thinking. How about this? Nick said after not getting an answer from her. I'm going to follow you to the nearest city. I'm going to wait outside of the city. You get in contact with Aegis and get a new barrier. And then I can tell you what you need to look up to prove my identity, okay? She looked at Nick for a while longer. What do you gain from that? She asked. What do you mean, what do I gain from that? Nick asked with a bit of annoyance. What do you gain from making me do all of these things? What is your plan? She asked. I told you, Nick said. I want to get into contact with the technician so that we can find out what's going on and find a solution." The woman shook her head. "Even if I were to assume that you're telling the truth, I can't see how it would make sense to do any of that." Nick remained silent as he looked with confused annoyance at the hero, who kept talking. "Assuming you told the truth, you used to be human," she said. "But you're not anymore. You're a Specter. You're not humanity's ally. You're humanity's enemy. Helping humanity would equate to hurting yourself, and the only thing Specters are not willing to do is to hurt themselves. What you're saying makes no sense." "I'm not humanity's enemy," Nick said with a severe tone. "I want to help humanity." "Why?" she asked. "Why?" Nick repeated. "Yes, why?" she repeated back. Silence. Nick's first answer would have been that he was human, but he quickly realized that this was no longer true. Naturally, Nick still knew that he wanted to help humanity, but it wasn't easy to find the right words for why. "Because I did horrible things in my past and want to atone for them," Nick said with less fight audible in his voice. "How is that related to humanity?" she asked. "Atone to the people you've wronged." "They're all dead," Nick answered. "I can't ask them for forgiveness anymore, and they also wouldn't grant it. The only thing I can do is to help others until the good I have done far outweighs the bad." The hero just kept looking at Nick evenly for a couple of seconds. "And that's why you want to help humanity?" she asked. Nick nodded, yes. The hero shook her head and sighed. It was almost like she was disappointed. "To think that I actually believed you for a second." A foreboding feeling appeared inside Nick. "But that proves it, you're a Specter." Nick wanted to object, but the woman didn't let him and continued talking. "You Specters can't see what it means to be human. You are all just thinking about yourselves. You have no experience in what it means to be selfless. I asked you why you wanted to help humanity, but the only thing you could come up with was something selfish. You only want to help humanity so that you feel better about yourself. The way you describe these things is like somebody that knows about something but has never experienced it. Why? Because you're a Specter, and you don't know how it feels when you want to help others. You only think about yourself." At that moment, a sneer appeared on her face. It seemed like she was internally berating herself for being so naive as to believe this Specter for even just a second. Nick grew increasingly frustrated. "What the fuck is she talking about?" he thought. "If I were to use her logic, every single person in the entire world would be selfish. People inherently search for happiness, and part of that happiness is living with the least amount of guilt or remorse possible. By her logic, apologizing to somebody you've hurt after losing control over your emotions is inherently selfish and inhumane. It would also be selfish to help a beggar at the side of the road because you just want to get rid of the feelings of pity you're feeling. What bullshit is this? According to your logic, a person—" "There," the hero shouted, interrupting Nick. "Logic? You're talking about logic again. This is about emotions." Nick grew even more frustrated but also more panicked. This hero was his best shot at connecting with Aegis, but she kept saying that Nick didn't know what it meant to be human. Shing. At that moment, the hero suddenly vanished. Ding. Nick immediately exploded with light since the hero was obviously about to unleash an attack. In an instant, Nick turned ethereal and rapidly moved towards his right. For the first time in a long while, his ability was active again. At the same time, Nick's newfound sensitivity of his senses increased as well, and he saw the surrounding kilometers with extreme clarity. That was when Nick's eyes widened in surprise. He felt a very faint trace of Zephyx around 5 kilometers away, and it was vanishing. She fled, Nick thought. That was when Nick realized that this actually made a lot of sense. She knew that Nick wasn't weak and that he had even killed a hero. She wouldn't fight him, at least not without a barrier. Even after several seconds passed, Nick's ability didn't deactivate. Nobody was perceiving him. She had left. She had fled. And now Nick was alone, somewhere in the world, without a barrier, and with no way to prove that he was human or used to be. Chapter 614. One Specter to Another. So what now? Nick was someplace, somewhere in the world. He did not have any of his belongings except for his 2 blades, and he was alone. Nick was not sure what to do now. I have to get to Aegis headquarters somehow, he thought. As long as I can talk to any shield, we can solve this issue. First, I need to find out where I am and get something to wear. Nick looked at his naked body for a moment before focusing on the horizon. The hero had already fled, and Nick didn't want to get close to her a second time. In her mind, Nick was a Specter, and if she saw him again, she would most likely attack or even request help. In fact, it was possible that she was doing this right now. Nick remembered the direction she had fled towards and charged in the opposite direction. He rapidly jumped from mountain to mountain, doing his best to stay hidden. With the power of his body and his ability, Nick's physical strength was on par with a hero's. This meant that he could traverse several kilometers per second. Naturally, if he didn't actively use his Zephyx to manipulate the air around him, he would create a sonic boom every time he moved. Additionally, Nick needed to form a resistant field of Zephyx in front of his hands and feet, and push it upward so that he didn't accidentally ascend too much. Nick had already learned about the concept of escape velocity, and he was dangerously close to reaching it. If someone moved too fast, they would move faster than the planet curved, which meant that they would essentially fall upward. This represented falling towards the sun, and the sun destroyed everything that went past a height of about 30 kilometers. Anything that reached that altitude or more would be turned into dust before being scattered back onto the ground. Nobody knew what was behind the sun. People weren't even sure if there was anything behind it. What if the world just ended? What if there was just nothing? Although Nick had also heard about the concept of planets and their world was a planet. So there had to be more, right? A lot of these things seemed a bit dodgy, and Nick was sure that this meant Aegis was keeping some things secret, but they probably had a good reason to. Nevertheless, the important part was that Nick had to be careful not to accidentally go too fast without rectifying his altitude. For the first time, he felt almost contained while being outside. 30 kilometers was not that much for somebody like Nick. With one proper jump, he could reach that altitude. It was scary to think that the simple act of jumping upward would kill him. Technically, Nick could also fly, since his body turned ethereal if nobody could perceive him, and he could just move his body with his mind under these conditions. However, Nick refrained from doing so. If anyone perceived him, he would just stop in the air and fall. Using the momentum of a jump was safer. Am I on a continent or on an island? Nick thought as he jumped to another mountain. It should be a continent. I don't think islands have that many mountains, he thought as he looked at the seemingly infinite stretch of mountains. That makes things harder. Nick jumped to the next mountain. Whoom! That was when he suddenly turned into mist and vanished. Just now, his ability had deactivated. As soon as Nick turned into mist, he entered a crack inside the mountain, after which his ability activated again. Shouldn't be a hero, Nick thought. A hero wouldn't lose track of me this quickly. The next moment, Nick made a hole in the crack and floated through. Even in his mist form, he could still cause quite some destruction. He was no longer the weak John who couldn't break some glass while infiltrating the Spartans. After a bit of searching around, Nick found the being that had perceived him. In a crag between two mountains was a very long and wide thing. It was about 40 meters long and about 2 meters wide, and it looked like it was part of the scenery. Yet that couldn't be further from the truth. In truth, it was a gigantic, rocky snake. If Nick's perception hadn't been enhanced by the maw, and if he hadn't felt that something had to be here thanks to his ability, he wouldn't have noticed it. Its shell seemed completely lifeless, and it felt like a genuine rock. However, Nick could feel the extremely subtle trembles going through its body. Thanks to his great experience with Specters, he could tell what these trembles were caused by. Something inside the snake was struggling. The snake had spotted Nick for just an instant while he had been jumping from one mountain to the next, but it hadn't seen him again since then. It should be somewhere in the middle of the adult level, Nick thought as he looked at it. For a while, Nick looked through his surroundings, making sure that there was nothing else. Bang! Then Nick materialized and jumped towards the snake. He arrived beside it in an instant. The next moment, stone began to crack, and the huge stone head of the snake moved away from the rock face to look at Nick. It didn't seem worried. It just looked at Nick casually. For a moment, Nick was shocked. Usually, Specters either surrendered immediately or fought back when faced with a powerful human. And then he remembered. He was no human. He was a Specter. Why would the snake be worried about another Specter? A moment later, Nick felt something he had never felt before. It was some kind of extremely complex feeling. It felt so incredibly alien. Yet, for some reason, Nick could tell what this feeling meant. It referred to the concept of a question regarding Nick's presence, and he could also tell that it was related to the snake. In essence, the snake was asking Nick why he was there. Nick furrowed his brows. Interesting, he thought. Is this how Specters communicate with each other? The feeling is very abstract. Can I communicate in the same way? Then Nick willed his mind to communicate with the snake. He wanted to ask where he was. Sure enough, he got an answer almost immediately, and he also knew what it meant. Rock. What rock? Nick sent back. Where are we? I don't want to know what the mountain is made of. I want to know where the mountain is. Rock here, food digest. No food around, safe. Why here? The feelings the snake sent to Nick were extremely simple, and it was clear that it didn't even understand Nick properly. It was even too stupid to understand that it didn't properly understand him. "Why here?" it asked again. "Where's next food place?" Nick asked back. "Here rock no food, not rock food, why here?" "I don't think I will get anything usable out of it," Nick thought with annoyance. To Nick, it was quite obvious that this Specter had abducted some humans, whom it held captive inside its body. Most likely, it gained power by constricting humans' freedom, similar to the prison. It was just far weaker. Bang! Nick unsheathed his blade and cut the snake into 2 pieces. "Surrender, let live," the rock snake sent without daring to move. When Nick felt that message, he realized how right humanity was. When put into a vacuum, these 3 words sounded like a cry of despair. Yet the feeling Nick had received was completely cold. There was zero emotion behind it. There was no fear, anger, shock, surprise, horror, or whatever. In an esoteric way, one could say that the rock snake's message felt soulless. It was gray. After Nick cut the snake in half, he saw its lower half vanishing into black smoke as 2 human bodies appeared. Bang! Both of them immediately jumped up and ran to the side, but they messed up their landing and fell. They probably haven't been able to move their bodies for a long time, Nick thought as he watched them. Shing! Nick bisected the snake again. He wanted to find its Specter core by seeing which half dissolved. After this slash, the snake tried to flee, but Nick just kept cutting it into pieces. Eventually, he found the Specter core and destroyed it. The rock snake was dead. Sadly, the death of the snake will probably create over 10 initial hatchlings somewhere, Nick thought. Then Nick looked at the humans whom he had freed. There were 4 of them, and 3 of them were trying to relearn how to use their bodies. Nick went to the person who still knew how to use hers. As soon as that person saw Nick, her elation of being freed turned to horror. They went from one Specter to another, and she could tell that this one was far more powerful. Chapter 615, Questions. Nick looked at the person who wasn't chaotically flailing around. She was a woman who seemed to be in her early 20s, but that didn't say much. According to the Zephyx, Nick could feel that she was in the earlier stages of the veteran level. She could also be 50 while still looking this young. Yet, despite just being freed from a gigantic snake Specter's belly, she still had something that Nick didn't. Clothes. "I just want to ask you a couple of questions," Nick said carefully after he noticed the woman's horrified expression. Not surprisingly, his words didn't help calm the Extractor down. "I'm scared," she said after a bit. "I can see that, but as I've said, I just want some answers to a couple of questions and you can go," Nick said with an uncertain tone. Why did she say that she was scared? Seems pointless. After that, surprisingly, she seemed to calm down. "I can reason with you, right?" she asked. Nick raised an eyebrow. Yes, was there any doubt about that? The Extractor's fear seemed to intensify again. It seemed like she was scared that she had somehow insulted Nick, even though insulting a Specter was basically impossible. "There are Specters that can talk but can't be reasoned with," she answered. Nick naturally knew that. "All right, so can I ask my questions now?" he asked. The next moment, the woman looked at the 3 other people who were slowly calming down. "Who are they?" she asked. Nick furrowed his brows in annoyance. "Victims of the rock snake, just like you." "Rock snake," she repeated. "Was that the Specter that captured us?" Nick was starting to get frustrated. "Yes, so can." "Where are we?" she asked. Nick took a deep breath, which felt strange since the air just entered his lungs, before leaving again without being changed in any way. After all, Nick didn't really have a normal metabolism anymore. "That would have been my first question," Nick answered. "How would I know? I was inside a rock snake for weeks or even months. I don't know where we are," she answered. Nick got annoyed for a moment before he realized that she was actually right. How would she know? He looked at the other 3 who had calmed down by now. They probably also wouldn't know. "Gather up," Nick shouted to the others. "We need to talk." The other 3 could immediately tell that Nick was a Specter. Many Specters had powers that allowed them to hide their malevolent auras from humans, but Nick was not one of them. Naturally, their fight-or-flight instincts immediately kicked in, but they also knew that there was no point in resisting. Nick felt far too powerful to them. They nervously glanced at each other before approaching. "All right, maybe some of you haven't realized it yet, but I was the one that killed the Specter and freed you," Nick said. The 4 of them looked at each other with a bit of confusion. "Why?" the woman from earlier asked. "Because I need some answers," Nick answered. "I just need a couple of answers and I will be gone." Nick's answers confused the Extractors. This was strange. A specter that just wanted answers. Was this some kind of weird trick to gather Zephyx? Did this specter grow more powerful by asking questions? Would they need to answer questions until they died of old age? I presume nobody of you knows where we are. Do the surroundings look familiar to you? Nick asked. The people looked around. Gray and brown mountains. I've seen some brown mountains before, one of them said. That was when Nick realized there was actually no point in asking if they recognized their surroundings. Who didn't see gray and brown mountains before? They were almost everywhere in the world. Where do you come from? I just need the names of the cities, Nick said. This question made the Extractors nervous again. Wash Basin City, one of them said. Wash Basin City, Nick repeated with furrowed brows. Is that real? It doesn't sound real. The person seemed to become nervous when Nick singled him out. We have a demon possession specter in the form of a huge pool. That's why the city has the name. Do you know what continent that city is on? Nick asked. The man looked at the other Extractors nervously before turning back to Nick. What's a continent? He asked. Nick blinked once. Do you know what an island is? No, the man answered. What about the weather? Is it cold or hot? There's rain about once a week, and the temperature is about the same as here. The sun always shines onto the city. Do you know where the nearest Aegis stronghold is? The man looked around at the other people, who just shook their heads. Aegis as in a shield, he asked. As in the organization Aegis. You know, the strongest organization of humanity, Nick repeated. The people just looked at each other with surprise. No, one of them said. Nick took a deep breath. I can't be mad at them, he thought. When I was a John, I also didn't know what Aegis or a continent was. At least I think I didn't. My past feels kind of blurry. What about you? Nick asked as he turned to another person. Where did you come from? Starkhold City, he answered. Nick didn't ask about the weird city name. Do you know where it is? He asked. It's surrounded by a wasteland. There are a couple of crevices and a couple of smaller mountains, the man answered. That doesn't really narrow it down, Nick thought. Nick asked the remaining two people, and just as expected, they didn't have anything he could use to find out where he was. The only thing of note was that all four came from different cities, which meant the Specter was probably moving from city to city to avoid getting found out after abducting somebody. How did that rock snake even capture you? Nick asked as he looked at the three Johns. Since when are Johns allowed to leave cities? The three of them looked with confusion at each other. Why wouldn't we be allowed to leave cities? Now Nick was confused. There are tons of powerful Specters outside. One would assume that most people wouldn't be allowed to put themselves in such danger. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of Specters in the wild, but my city doesn't have such draconian laws, one of them said. Plenty of people live and work outside of the city. This shocked Nick quite a bit. And that's safe, he asked. It's not, the guy answered. People get kidnapped by Specters all the time, but you just have to live with it. If you want to earn a living, you have to put your life on the line. The man talked about it as if there were no issues, and Nick almost became horrified. To these people, this was probably just normal life, but Nick knew that this was definitely not normal. Why would the governor allow something like that? Wait, is this to lure Specters to the city so that the manufacturers can more easily catch them? Are they fishing for Specters? All right, Nick said after a bit. We can go search for the nearest city. I will accompany you. As soon as we arrive, you can enter. Naturally, Nick's words made them suspicious. This sounded impossible. Why would a Specter let them go just like that? What was in it for the Specter? Let's walk towards the south, Nick said. The people became nervous. When would the other shoe drop? When would the Specter turn around and cause them immense suffering? Would Nick suddenly kill them? Sadly, there was nothing they could do. Nick was simply too powerful. In the end, they followed him. While they were walking after him, Nick furrowed his brows in frustration. He could feel Zephyx coming from them, which meant that they were suffering due to his presence right now. Nick had tried his best to calm down their fears, but nothing seemed to help. In a way, the Zephyx he felt coming from them was disgusting to him. These were innocent and helpless people, and they were suffering because of him. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do. He could only hope that they would find a city soon. The five of them continued towards the south for quite a while. During that time, they did not find another Specter. There's a human, Nick suddenly said. The other four looked around but couldn't find the human. He's a late or peak veteran. Do you wish to be seen by him? You are free to do so, but you know the risk, Nick said. The people looked around in confusion. Risk? What risk? One of them asked. Getting killed for profit, Nick said. Two of the people turned white in horror. "But that's illegal," one of them shouted. Nick furrowed his brows and looked at the guy. Are they truly this naive, or are these cities just very different from Crimson City? "So I assume you want to meet him," Nick said. The four looked at each other before nodding. "Fine." Chapter 616, Abyss City. The group of four walked forward on their own. Naturally, Nick kept himself hidden. After a bit, the late or peak veteran noticed the group and looked at them. The four people waved at him to come over, but the man only narrowed his eyes before running away. The four survivors were a bit confused by that reaction. Obviously, they lost sight of the lone human, but Nick didn't. Nick quickly saw the man running towards the east for a while and followed after him. After all, this was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to know where the next city was so that he could find out where he was. A couple of seconds later, the man jumped behind a seemingly random rock. Thanks to his powerful senses, Nick could essentially perceive everything behind the rock perfectly without having to look past it. There was a single woman behind the rock, and the man was reporting to her. Early or mid-expert, Nick thought. After quickly reporting, the two of them ran back towards the surviving humans whom Nick had freed. Nick watched from a distance as the two humans interrogated the four survivors and performed several tests on them. When they determined that the survivors were human, they led them away. Nick had the urge to sigh in relief, but that was difficult since he technically didn't really have lungs. They looked like lungs, but that was it. He had been ready to get involved and to persuade the people from the city to not kill the survivors. Nick didn't want these people, whom he had just saved, to be killed immediately after. Naturally, thanks to his advanced senses, he was also able to overhear the conversations between them. Not surprising that they are warning them about me, he thought. As soon as they had met each other, the survivors had immediately told the humans that there was a powerful Specter around. Initially, the humans from the nearest city didn't believe them since they thought the survivors were Specters themselves. But as soon as it turned out that they were human, the Extractors from the closest city started to become nervous. It's strange, Nick thought as he watched them run towards the northeast. I saved their lives. I escorted them to the closest city. I even protected them from the shadows. And yet they fear me and would immediately kill me if given the opportunity. Nick looked at them with a complicated expression. But can I blame them? I would act the same way. Specters can't have feelings, and Specters would never help humans without significant personal gain. Nick looked down, but it still feels unfair. Nick could understand why they were acting this way, but in his case, it was not justified. He did nothing but help them. Nevertheless, Nick had expected that something like that would happen, and he quickly followed them. A group of humans knew that a Specter was most likely following them, but what were they supposed to do? They were most likely not powerful enough to resist the Specter, and the only safe place for them was their city. Of course, the survivors said that the Specter was unusually interested in the closest city, but they didn't have any power to do something about that. If the Specter was strong enough to deal with the city, it would have found the city anyway, and if it wasn't, why should they be afraid? After running for a couple of minutes, more people showed up in the surroundings. A while later, Nick saw the group meeting up with another group of Extractors. The group was talking respectfully to the new group, and Nick could hear where they were coming from. Abyss City, Nick repeated in his mind, quite an ominous name. The group the survivors had met belonged to the guards of Abyss City. Nick knew the names of around 200 different cities, but all of them were in the Great Triangle. After all, he had gone on missions to many different cities over the span of 8 years. When it came to the Great Triangle, Nick probably knew almost every city. Sadly, the name Abyss City was not familiar to him. Most likely means that I'm not in the Great Triangle. The number of Extractors probably also means that I'm not in the Desolate Continent. I think this is a continent, which means I can only be in the Grand Continent, the War Continent, or the Long Continent. As far as I know, the Southern Continent doesn't have any cities. Naturally, Nick had learned a lot about the continents during his time as a trainee. The Grand Continent was the biggest continent in the world, essentially a big circle with a long outcropping near the west. The War Continent was southwest of the Grand Continent, called as such because not many fortifications were found, yet many weapon shells and destroyed weapons could be, showing that this land had most likely been the victim of many, many wars. The Long Continent was connected to the Great Triangle and was south of it. The Southern Continent was pretty small and was south of the Long Continent. The Southern Continent barely had any ruins from past humans. It seemed like most humans didn't much care about it, which was strange. All the other continents had many ruins, but this one barely had any. Yet, it didn't seem any different from the others. Just like the others, it was made of wastelands and mountains. After Nick had followed them for a while, he saw the first couple of buildings in the city. Although was this truly a city, the first buildings Nick could see many kilometers away were made of stuff that could only be called scrap. It was like the old Dregs. Rusty metal plates were stacked on top of each other to make rusty and dirty huts. Even more, there was no wall protecting them. It was like the huts were built in the outside world without any protection, which was crazy to Nick. This essentially put these people in severe danger. Almost no cities that Nick had seen in the Great Triangle were built like this. There, it was policy that no civilian building was allowed to be built outside of a fortification. The reason was that it was simply too dangerous. If the city allowed normal people to live outside, the enormous casualties would severely compromise the city's economy. Sure, a city's economy was mostly based on specters and manufacturers, but they needed normal people to get new extractors, and normal people also needed a certain economy. But here, apparently, this policy was not in effect. After Nick saw the first buildings, he split off from the group. He didn't need to rely on them anymore and looked around on his own. As Nick closed in on the city, he realized how they managed to offset the enormous loss of revenue due to the high level of casualties. So many, the sheer number of rusty huts was abnormal. There were rusty huts as far as the eye could see, and that was not the only surprising part. So many children. When Nick looked at the different households, he saw that over 50% of all the people were children. Every pair of adults had, on average, 3 to 4 children, and those were only the ones that were alive at this moment. And Nick noticed something else as well. There are also a lot of elderly, he thought. In Crimson City, people mostly died of old age when they hit their 50s or 60s, and people who were 45 years old or older were considered elderly. The people here looked far older on average, but Nick could also tell that they were actually not as old as they seemed. Are people aging quicker here? Someone that looked like they were 50 was actually 40 in this city. Nick could tell that due to the many conversations he was able to overhear. Even more, the elderly are no longer working. This entire situation perplexed Nick. It seemingly made no sense. Children and the elderly were both burdens on the economy since they consumed without contributing. The fact that the city had that many of both would mean that one adult needed to support around 4 people who couldn't work. This was crazy. After looking at everything for a while, Nick finally found out how this was possible. Near the middle of the city, he saw a huge queue made up of children. All of them were queuing up in front of a building with several containment units. Obviously, this was a manufacturer. That explains things, Nick thought as his eyes narrowed. The children are also contributing, and by the looks of things, they're the only ones that can do whatever it is they need to do in that manufacturer. The parents are supporting the grandparents and the children are supporting the parents. That's why there are so many of them. But there are barely any adults. There are basically more elderly than adults. Does that mean that something happened recently? Or is this a cyclical thing, where the age distribution shifts around based on the previous generation? Nick looked at the huge queue of children. Nevertheless, the lack of adults compared to the high number of children means there is a high child mortality rate. Seems like the child labor here is quite dangerous. Chapter 617, Too Much Power. Nick looked at the city for a while. He just watched the children enter and exit the containment unit. Apparently, they only needed to work in there for a couple of minutes before leaving. They seemed barely any different after leaving. In fact, they didn't even look injured or distraught. They just seemed normal. That was until Nick saw a teenage boy enter and leave. Did he grow a beard? Nick thought as he looked at him. Earlier, the boy had seemed too young to grow a beard, but when he came out, he seemed just the right age to have the first hairs above his lip. After that, Nick looked a bit closer. Sure enough, they all seemed to age a bit after entering and exiting, he thought. So, does this Specter make them age? Is that why the children are working with it? Is that also why the old people are that young? A bit later, Nick also saw an adult queuing up. Strange. Until now, I've only seen children in the queue. I wonder what happens if an adult enters. Nick waited to see what would happen to the adult. When he came back out, he looked like he was 5 years older. He aged by a lot more than the children. Is this based on perceived aging instead of static aging? Nick thought. When a 10-year-old ages by a year, it probably feels just as long to them as when a 25-year-old ages by 5 years. So that's what the Specter is about, huh? It grows more powerful by stealing life from people. Nick observed a couple more conversations. There was someone who looked 30 and was actually 18, a 16-year-old who was 8, a 40-year-old who was 20. However, there was also a 20-year-old that looked to be about 20. Not everyone was unnaturally old. The closer people live to the middle of the city, the more their appearance resembles their actual age. The buildings are also made of better materials and are taller. Makes sense. Living near the outside of the city means being at the mercy of more specters. Naturally, people with power would gravitate towards living in the middle, while the poor are stuck on the outside. Additionally, the poor rely on the easy money from the aged specter, which makes them appear older. Nick's eyes narrowed. This is actually worse than it looks. Young people lack the maturity to confront specters. An extractor 16 or younger is rare since their minds lack an adult's stability, which makes them prone to mistakes under fear and danger. The people near the outside of the city are mismatched with their true age. By the time their minds peak around 20, their bodies will already be degrading into their 30s. That makes it very difficult to become an extractor. Nick stayed in his mist form and entered the city. There were barely any sensors or walls anywhere. This was one of the worst defended cities Nick had ever seen. They don't need impressive defenses, Nick thought as he looked at the sea of people he had already passed. Their defenses are masses of meat and lives. By the looks of it, this city probably has over 40,000 inhabitants. That's actually crazy. In the 100 or so cities I've visited in the Great Triangle, I only saw about 3 with so many inhabitants. As Nick continued towards the east, he finally found out why the city was called Abyss City. At the east side was a huge body of water. Nick couldn't be sure if it was a big lake or an ocean. However, at its shore, there was a huge body of swirling black water. It was impossible to see the bottom. Not even Nick could look at the bottom, and that was everything he needed to know. To him, darkness was just as bright as light, and Nick's vision was not reduced by it. The fact that he couldn't see the bottom meant that this was not darkness. It's the body of a gigantic specter, Nick thought. The humongous whirlpool was one specter, and it was almost 3 kilometers wide. This has to be a force specter, Nick thought. Obviously, approaching it was extremely dangerous. This specter isn't even really contained, Nick thought as he looked at it. He saw a couple of big obelisks near the shore. By now, Nick was pretty good at zephology, and he could tell what these obelisks were for. They redirect and absorb Zephyx. Most likely, when the abyss produces Zephyx, the obelisks absorb a good amount of it. I think I've seen enough of the city. I'm not here to sightsee. I'm here to find a way back to Aegis. Nick quickly looked for some powerful people. He found a couple of experts and even a specialist, but they were not really talking to each other. Nick's plan had been to overhear their conversations to learn about where he was in the world, but they probably wouldn't randomly start talking about geography while walking around outside. Should I ask someone? Nick thought. He shook his head. No, I'm not able to hide my Zephyx and they will just start shouting as soon as they see me. I don't know how many heroes this city has and I don't want to find out. I have to find these things out on my own. Nick looked for someone he could question. After a while, he saw the expert from earlier arriving in the city with the survivors. Then he saw her meeting another expert who then left the city. Nick decided to follow that expert. Nobody had noticed him yet, but that wasn't very surprising. The city's defenses were horrible, and Nick was incredible at staying hidden. As long as there wasn't a hero actively searching for him, he wouldn't be found. As Nick followed after the expert, he couldn't help his thoughts wandering to some dark places. It's actually scary that I could effectively take down this entire city on my own. I just have to find the governor, assassinate them in secret, find the next hero, assassinate them, and so on. I could even free a couple of specters and some containment units by simply attacking them. After all, I have 2 extremely powerful blades, and I have the physical power of a hero. I could break most containment units designed to house fanatics. Then, the fanatics would break out and deal with the remaining inhabitants. At that moment, Nick took a deep breath. He didn't like that he was thinking about these things. He felt scared of what he could potentially do. He had so much power now. Yet I've had this power for a long while. Why is it suddenly a problem now? Nick thought. Sadly, he already knew the answer. He just didn't like it. He was a specter, and that made him scared of himself. He had the capability to do evil, and he had the power. He even was part of a group that was supposed to do nothing but commit evil. Nick still saw himself as a human, but he knew that he was just running away. In truth, he was a specter, and he knew it. Would he one day forget what it meant to be human and start becoming a specter? Would he start to ignore the suffering of people and use his power to benefit no one but himself? Nick became scared. He became scared of himself. He became scared of what he might turn into. He didn't want to turn into a true specter, but what if he had no choice? What if he started seeing hurting people as just another bit of training? What if, like every other specter, he was just trying to attain more and more power? Nick noticed that the expert was traveling alone now and he grew nervous. This was nothing special. He had done things like this many, many times in the past. It was a standard takedown, and yet Nick hadn't been this scared of a takedown in forever. In the end, he gritted his teeth. Bang! The barrier of the man appeared and broke an instant later. His expression turned shocked, but then he vanished. Nick had grabbed his leg and had pulled him into the sand below him. Naturally, the man was covered in darkness in an instant, and Nick used his newly upgraded ability from the nightmare. The man felt like he couldn't breathe anymore since he had run out of Zephyx, and his Zephysis had been interrupted. Obviously, Nick wouldn't kill the guy. However, as sorry as he was, he still needed the man to become delirious enough for his mind to drop its guard. Many seconds passed as the man struggled many meters below the sand. He was dying. And then, Nick injected feelings and visions into his mind, and it started to associate these things with other things. A couple seconds later, Nick knew the general area of where he was, but he still didn't know exactly where he was. Bang! Nick knocked the guy out before infusing him with some Zephyx. Luckily, humans could also absorb Specter Zephyx. The man's Zephysis activated again, and a couple of seconds later he woke up. Immediately, he was assaulted by the nightmare's influence. Boom! Sand exploded, and the man jumped up into the light of day. People around him immediately turned to look at him, and they looked at him with frowns. Why was he naked? Chapter 618, Big Target. While several people in Abyss City started to sound the alarm, Nick was traveling towards the south in his new clothes. Naturally, he wouldn't stay in the city after he had just attacked an expert. According to what the expert knew, this was a relatively thin but long stretch of land between two seas, one in the east, one in the west. Although thin might not be the correct word. There were about 400 kilometers between the two shores, and the expert didn't know how far the land continued in the north and the south. Abyss City was at the shore of the eastern sea or ocean. Technically, it could also be a very big lake. Nick couldn't be sure. One other thing he knew was that there were a lot of mountains here, an entire mountain range going from shore to shore. Nick didn't know a lot about geography, and he still wasn't sure which continent he was on. He could only be sure that he was on a continent since mountain ranges this long and massive most likely were not on islands. I should go to cross Mark City to the south, Nick thought. It was the furthest city from Abyss City that the expert knew about, around 300 kilometers to the southwest. Nick left the mountain range behind and crossed relatively even terrain as he traveled south. He saw a couple of lakes, but they were not crazily big. Eventually, he reached a lake that was a little bit bigger, over 20 kilometers wide and over 50 kilometers long. It was far smaller than the two seas or oceans north of this place, but it was still quite big. Beside the lake, Nick saw another one of these cities without any walls. Just like Abyss City, Crossmark City barely had any and simply defended itself by throwing mountains of human bodies at the Specters. However, compared to Abyss City, there was a normal distribution of ages here. A good number of children, a large number of adults, a small number of elderly. Once again, it wasn't difficult for Nick to enter the city, and he quickly searched for somebody to question. After searching for several minutes, he grew a bit annoyed. I can only question one person before I have to flee again. That sucks. I don't even know anyone from this place. If I could just find out more about the people of this city, I could search for a better target. However, that means killing someone to stop them from ringing the alarm, and I don't want to do that. Although. After that, Nick decided to focus on the poorer parts of the city a bit more. Maybe, if I'm lucky. Nick focused on the different houses and inspected them one at a time. Half an hour passed until he finally found something. Finally, inside a seemingly random shack, Nick found a couple of imprisoned children. Just now, a John had entered the shack, and the children immediately began to panic. Nick was reminded of that one panda pirate from Cycle. With so many people and this strong of a lack of control, there has to be rampant crime, and there had to be an extractor that's involved in some unsavory things, Nick thought as he approached the shack. Naturally, Nick wasn't the biggest fan of killing a human. As long as he saw them as human, that was. Nick entered the house through one of the cracks and approached the man, who was about to drop his pants. The next moment, Nick materialized behind him and grabbed his mouth and nose. Naturally, the man immediately became panicked and tried to tear himself free, but a John couldn't possibly break the grasp of a specialist. Funnily enough, Nick hadn't even needed to destroy the man's barrier since he had deactivated it himself. Cheap barriers didn't have a frisky mode. Obviously, the children started to panic even more. Somehow, this new person felt even more dangerous than the man. "Shut up," Nick shouted. "Silence." I'm going to break down the wall and you can run to wherever you want, or you can remain here. Depends on you. The children were confused. Bang! Nick kicked one of the walls down and ran out while keeping the man in his grasp. Naturally, the explosion immediately alarmed the neighborhood, but this was in one of the poorer parts of the city, and there were barely any extractors around. The few that were present were newbies or Johns. Nick quickly charged towards the east, and as soon as the streets gave way to dirt, he dug downwards. He essentially just needed to kick the air above him to generate enough power to rival an artillery shell. An explosion of dirt appeared, followed by several quakes below ground. If there were any powerful extractors nearby, they could most likely follow Nick. But there wasn't. A couple of extractors arrived, but they realized that they couldn't catch up with whatever was digging downward. The dirt that Nick pushed to the side constantly fell back into the hole. After traveling through the ground for about half a minute, Nick stopped and focused on the John in his hand. Fuck, I wasn't careful, Nick thought. The John in his hands had several broken bones and open wounds. At least he's still alive. The John's mind had already been influenced by the nightmare, and Nick decided to join in. The visions that the John saw changed, and Nick started to go through all possible things, organizations, cities, specters, laws, and so on. This time, Nick decided to keep going at it for several minutes. After all, the John's survival and comfort were not of his concern. Eventually, Nick just squeezed the man's head into a meat paste and focused on the city far above him again. While the John didn't know a lot about things outside the city, he knew about the things inside it. Nick knew the names of the different manufacturers and how strong they were. The priesthood, Nick thought as he slightly narrowed his eyes. Their CZE seems like a good target. The priesthood was the second biggest manufacturer in the city, and its strongest member was their CZE, a peak specialist. Naturally, the priesthood did not have any heroes. The strongest specter of the priesthood was the water manifestation, some kind of flying pyramid that created powerful elixirs based on how much worship and prayer it received. Most criminals in the city were forced to become worship slaves for years until they were released again. Nick didn't care about that since he didn't care about the criminals. Yet there was an open secret about the priesthood. While they denounced crime and preached ethics, they were actually running the majority of crime in the city. If one wanted to become a criminal, one needed to give them a certain amount of their profits. Otherwise, the priesthood would capture them and make them a worship slave. In essence, they had a monopoly on crime. Nick was not the biggest fan of that. I'm going to grab that CZE and question her. If there's nothing wrong with her, I can let her go, and if I find out that she is causing suffering to the people, I will kill her. Additionally, a peak specialist should know where I am, especially if she's the leader of such a big manufacturer. But for now, I should stay underground. It doesn't matter if I come back a couple of days later. For the next several hours, Nick decided to wait deep underground. While the most powerful people had not been alarmed by what he had done since John's constantly vanished, Nick still wanted to be careful. Eventually, he surfaced outside the city again and re-entered it. Once again, it didn't prove to be a challenge. After just a couple of seconds, Nick saw the priesthood's building. They had built a pyramid, about 300 meters high. That would be impressive if Nick hadn't grown up in Crimson City. Aegis headquarters was also a pyramid, and that thing was way bigger. Then Nick waited. The CZE comes out every day in the morning to preach about being a good human. That should be a great opportunity. Hours passed, and Nick saw people gathering in front of the pyramid before going down on their knees. By the end of it, he saw over 1,000 people kneeling in the plaza in front of the huge pyramid. And then it was time. An older woman with a friendly and peaceful smile walked out of the pyramid, flanked by two big men. "Welcome, children of the pyramid," she shouted. Nick looked at her. Chapter 619, Servants of Gluttony. Children of the pyramid. That was how the CZE referred to the people kneeling in front of their sanctuary. The pyramid shape of the building might have given it a certain religious taste, but it didn't change the fact that this was an office building, corporate headquarters. But people in desperation will cling on to anything that might give them hope, Nick thought as he looked at the devoted followers. He couldn't help but make a comparison to Aegis and the Champion of Light. Except that the Champion of Light actually wants to help the people and doesn't just want to line his own pockets. "Sow kindness and harvest kindness," the old woman shouted with an elated smile. "Reciprocate kindness and receive kindness." Up until now, Nick could empathize with the message somewhat. After all, he also was a big fan of giving kindness to others. "Unless they are followers of gluttony," she shouted. Gluttony, Nick thought as his eyes narrowed. That's one of Famine's servants. How is this suddenly related to gluttony? Death, the trio of destruction, and the 7 corruptors were all known to basically everyone in Aegis. Death was the leader of the trio of destruction, and it was humanity's biggest enemy since it actively tried to destroy Aegis. The trio of destruction were Death's servants. As its name suggested, Death's goal was to turn the world into a wasteland with no life, achieved through its 3 servants and their unique ways. Famine was one of Death's servants, a mid-adversary that gained power by starving people. Pestilence was also one of Death's servants, an early adversary that gained power by spreading disease and suffering related to one's health. War was Death's last servant, a late adversary that gained power through generating conflict between humans. Despite what one might think when hearing its name, War was not some powerful and brutal warrior but a covert and subtle manipulator. After all, openly attacking someone would just make them attack you, instead of attacking each other. Luckily, while the trio of destruction was seen as a single unit, nothing could be further from the truth. All 3 of their desired goals led to death, which was why Death could work with them, but none of their goals aligned with each other. When hungry people became sick, they died very quickly, which would be a waste. Hungry and sick people also avoided going to war due to severe exhaustion. Under normal circumstances, the trio of destruction would be each other's enemies and would even actively try to destroy each other since there were only so many humans in the world. However, Death's overwhelming power kept them at bay. Although, that also wasn't a certainty. Death was the only adversary that had other adversaries as servants. Every other adversary only had fallen or weaker as servants. The reason was that adversaries were extremely resourceful with diverse powers. It was supremely difficult to kill or capture them, evident by the fact that Aegis had not managed to capture even a single one while having 7 shields. The only adversary they had access to was here voluntarily. Death had a unique power over its namesake, and that power also extended to Specters. When it came to killing and fighting other Specters, Death was probably the most powerful Specter out there, proportional to its power. So even though it was just a little stronger in level than War, it was still much stronger. Yet, suppressing something was more difficult than killing it. War had already become a late adversary, and while it couldn't fight Death on its own, it wasn't helpless. If somehow the 3 of them managed to put their differences aside to deal with Death, they might be able to win. The chances of that happening were not low since all 3 had a common enemy. They wanted to kill each other the most, but they couldn't while Death existed. Even more, Death was stuck near Aegis headquarters, and it couldn't micromanage the trio of destruction. All in all, the alliance between the trio of destruction was shaky at best. However, that didn't extend to their servants. Between their servants there was no alliance at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. They hated each other almost more than they hated humanity. Each of the trio of destruction had several fallen as their servants, but their most powerful servants were the 7 corruptors. All 7 of them were peak fallen and could potentially become adversaries at any moment. Aegis wasn't sure what the 7 corruptors needed to do to become adversaries. Envy and gluttony were servants of famine. Wrath and pride were servants of war. Sloth and lust were servants of pestilence. Greed was the only free Specter. The reason for that was simple. Greed was very, very good at escaping. It might not be powerful enough to fight any of the trio, but it was still very difficult for any of them to find and successfully kill it. Greed belonged to the few Specters that basically couldn't be forced into servitude. Another one of these Specters was the Eternal Hunger, the Specter that created the black blobs all over the world that tried to eradicate all life. That Specter was basically unkillable, and trying to kill it would cost Death more than it was worth, making the Eternal Hunger a free Specter as well. Funnily enough, it used to be Famine's servant, but it grew too powerful to be controlled, too efficient at what it was doing, and it grew far too quickly. Do I have some kind of connection with Famine? Nick thought after he heard the CZE of the priesthood talking about gluttony. I've basically come into contact with both of Famine's main servants now. The CZE kept talking about the followers of gluttony, and that bestowing kindness upon them was equal to self-harm. The people kept agreeing, and soon, the positive atmosphere was completely replaced with rage and hatred. Down with gluttony, down with gluttony, down with gluttony, the people echoed. Nick wasn't sure what this was all about. He wouldn't have expected that a bunch of normal humans would dare to be this openly hostile to a peak fallen. Servant of gluttony. Suddenly, an extremely loud shout reverberated from someone in the crowd, and the people jumped to the side, isolating the shouting person. There, in the middle of the crowd, was a man holding up the arm of a figure wearing a cowl. In the figure's hand was a bundle of credits. The figure tried with all of its power to pull itself away, but the man's grip was too strong. Bang! Then the figure kicked the man in the balls and tore itself away. Servant of gluttony. The crowd shouted in rage and swarmed upon the figure. In an instant, the figure was drowned by enraged people. The cowl and the clothing were torn off, revealing a now naked older lady. The crowd punched and kicked her before lifting her and throwing her onto the stage, severely injured. The woman looked up in despair and confusion. Her eyes met with the CZE's. The CZE's eyes were filled with disdain. Servant of gluttony, she reprimanded with a cold voice. The next moment, a city guard arrived in front of the injured woman and pulled her into the pyramid. Undoubtedly, she would become a prayer slave. While all of this was happening, the crowd was shouting in rage, hatred, and bloodlust. Gluttony servants will never win, the CZE shouted. The crowd echoed with an uplifting battle cry. While righteous indignation is justified when dealing with gluttony servants, let us not forget that we must still give kindness to our kin, the CZE spoke with a much calmer voice. In less than 10 seconds, the crowd calmed down before kneeling again. People were closing their eyes with peaceful smiles as they listened to her. Servants of gluttony, Nick thought with a raised eyebrow. That was just a normal woman that tried to pickpocket someone. Pretty sure a servant of gluttony would be a specter. Is the gluttony she is talking about actually referring to the servant of famine, or is she referring to gluttony as a concept? Nick frowned. So is this just a misunderstanding? Nick scratched his head a bit. That would be annoying. Then his gaze went to the entrance of the pyramid. But that's a bit strange. As far as I know, the priesthood is only the second strongest manufacturer in the city. Yet, the city guards seem to follow the CZE's instructions. Something like that only happens in cities where the strongest manufacturer is basically the unofficial leader of the city. I've never seen a mere peak specialist ordering guards around this casually. Something strange is going on. Chapter 620, Door. The CZE finished her sermon after a while, and she turned back to walk inside again. The people in front of the building jumped up with newfound energy and returned to their lives. In a certain way, they seemed motivated and happy. It was like their purpose had been reignited. Naturally, Nick knew a lot about psychology, and he could see what was happening. Many people just want their own opinion reaffirmed, and if they can't get that, they'll believe whatever is most convenient. The CZE is patting them on the back for being better than others while giving them moral cover to be horrible people. Anyone who doesn't follow their beliefs is a horrible person, so attacking them is justified. Reciprocating kindness with kindness and enmity with enmity isn't a bad philosophy in itself. But to them, neutrality equates enmity, which justifies acting on it. And you can't even accuse her of inciting violence. She said the followers of gluttony deserve enmity, but she never defined who they are. Asked directly, she'd say she meant specters serving the actual gluttony, or humans consumed by greed. Either answer would be justified. She keeps the definition vague on purpose, letting people fill in their own targets without her ever having to correct them. Nick looked at the people. They seem happy and peaceful, but that happiness hides a tremendous potential for violence and hatred. These people would probably tear a poor mother into pieces because she stole a little bit of food for her malnourished baby, and they would probably do so with a smile while also believing that they were doing good. Nick released a short snort. Sounds a bit like me. The next moment, Nick transformed into mist and moved towards the pyramid. Except that my actions bring actual, tangible, and positive results. The door behind the CZE closed, and she walked down the lavish entrance hall of her building. Waterfalls of fine sand ran down the sides of the yellow hall, falling into pools of fine sand. People had vanished in these pools before. After walking for a bit, she gestured to the side, and the two men behind her performed a quick bow before leaving. Their purpose was not to protect her. After all, she was a peak specialist. No, they were just here to give her an aura of majesty and power. Naturally, any worthwhile extractor could feel her immense power and knew that she was more impressive than any of her guards. However, normal people were not like that. They required a show to truly believe. She slowly walked through the surprisingly empty halls of the pyramid. One would think that cleaning personnel, clerks, technicians, and administrators would frequent these halls, but that didn't seem to be the case. She slowly walked to one of the staircases and walked upwards. For over 5 minutes, she walked up the stairs with a leisurely pace. Eventually, she arrived on one of the highest floors and entered a long hallway. Weirdly enough, there were no doors along the hallway. There was just one big gate at the end. She approached it and summoned a white barrier. Her barrier gave off a lot of Zephyx, and a moment later the gate opened slowly. She slowly walked through. Bang! Suddenly the gate slammed shut with incredible power, barely missing her leg. Shit, Nick thought as he looked at the closed gate in front of him. Naturally, he wanted to slip in after her and deal with her, but the gate closed so fast that he couldn't even react. Why did this gate open so slowly but close so quickly? Nick looked through the pristine and brightly shining hallway. There were no gaps. It looked like the entire hallway was made of one piece of blindingly bright metal. I can't hide anywhere in this hallway, he thought. Sure, it was difficult to see Nick when he was in his mist form, but it wouldn't be difficult while he was in this hallway. Anyone would notice the cloud of mist in one of the corners or at the end of the bright hallway. While the CZE seemed to be the only person working on this floor, if anyone wanted to visit her, they would see Nick. Well, unless he waited in the corner beside the entrance. But in that case, the CZE would see him as soon as she exited her office. It would be a 50-50 guess. It's a long shot, but maybe. Nick slowly approached the entrance to the CZE's office. While he could technically break down the door and charge in, he wouldn't do so since that would defeat the entire purpose of being sneaky. The entire building would notice if Nick broke through the door, leaving him no time for the interrogation. Nick looked at the door for a long time and found a hidden console, used by maintenance personnel to program the door in case there was an error. Sadly, the console was password protected. Not even an override function, Nick thought with annoyance. They value privacy and security for this office so highly that they would rather replace the entire door than have any potential security flaw. And just as luck would have it, I don't have my barrier with my override codes anymore. Over the years of working as a liaison, being a trainee, and working with a technician, Nick had learned a lot about technology and zephology. Getting into a containment unit that could house adults and weaker wasn't difficult for him, but for anything bigger, he needed his override codes. Sadly, even if he knew the codes, he would need his barrier to inject them into the door. While there was a console, it didn't connect to the virtual interface that accepted the override codes. Only a barrier from Aegis could interact with that. Nick fumbled around on the console for a couple of seconds before stopping. Some of these consoles really didn't like it when somebody did stuff with them without showing any authorization. Well, nothing I can do, Nick thought before turning into mist again. Nick stopped in one of the upper corners above the door to the office and looked at the entrance to the stairway. As long as I keep focusing, I should be able to perceive whoever enters before they can perceive me, giving me a moment to use my illusion ability to make myself invisible long enough to slither behind them. I just have to be really fast. If they even think for a moment that they might have seen something, they will perceive me, and my illusion will break into pieces. I really don't want to wait in the stairwell. Attacking her in there could alert everyone else inside at that time. If Nick could sigh, he would have done so. I guess I'll have to wait until she leaves her office. I just hope it won't take too long. Nevertheless, Nick was mentally preparing himself for a long wait. Ding! But he didn't need to. The door to the office opened just a couple of seconds later. Nick immediately prepared himself to attack the CZE. However, that plan was immediately abandoned as Nick realized something crucial. His ability had deactivated. In an instant, Nick scanned the entire hallway but didn't see anyone else. His perception also covered the CZE, and he could tell that she was scanning the hallway for something, but based on the way she was doing it, Nick could also tell that she didn't know where he was. This immediately told Nick two things. First, the CZE did not know where he was but knew that someone had to be there. Second, she was not the reason his ability had deactivated. Yet, Nick couldn't even take a guess as to who or what had, since he saw the reason an instant later. Serve or die. A voice came out from the CZE's office. It was seemingly filled with unending hatred and disdain for everything living. As soon as Nick heard it, he also felt two glaring eyes looking at him. It was like someone with incredible power was perceiving him. In the middle of the office was something Nick hadn't seen in decades, but still remembered its appearance as if he had seen it yesterday. 4 stones, surrounded by a stone circle comprised of 7 stones, with a statue in front of the circle. A major relay. The statue in front of the circle was of a muscular man who was burning with rage and hatred. It was looking directly at the place where Nick was. Nick had never seen this specter before, but just based on the absolutely enraged aura, he could tell who that was. Wrath, Servant of War, one of the 7 corruptors. Chapter 621, Servant. Nick's mind went wild as soon as he realized what was going on. One of the 7 corruptors, Wrath, would kill him. However, Nick only believed that for an instant before his mind regained rationality, and the more he thought about it, the more answers he found. They did not sense me while in there since my ability didn't activate earlier, yet they knew that I was out here without sensing me. Nick remembered the door that had so suddenly closed behind the CZE. He had felt that was strange, and sure enough, it was strange. Which door would close with such force and violence shortly after someone's foot just barely entered? It has some sort of automatic reaction to Specter Zephyx, Nick realized. As soon as I closed in on the door, it slammed shut since it senses my Zephyx. The CZE did not see me, but as soon as the door slammed shut, she knew that there had to be a Specter here. If she were human, she would have immediately run out of the building and would have called the governor for help. After all, while she wouldn't know how strong I was, she would know that I had to be confident in taking her down since I was following her this closely. However, she obviously isn't human, Nick thought. No human would dare to interact with one of the 7 corruptors. Nick slowly moved down from the ceiling, and the CZE's eyes immediately locked onto him. Compared to how she had seemed during her big speech earlier, she seemed almost dead. There were no emotions on her face. It was almost like a corpse was looking at Nick. A second later, Nick turned into his human form again and looked at the statue representing Wrath. His eyes were just as dead as the CZE's. A force Specter that can turn into a human, Wrath said with gritted teeth. If Nick didn't know that Wrath was a Specter, he would think that it was frustrated and angry at him. "Why did you follow my servant?" Wrath asked, sounding like he was trying his best not to explode on Nick. Nick did not immediately answer. The more he analyzed the situation, the better it actually seemed. Back when Nick had seen Envy, he had been at Envy's mercy. It would have sucked his power out of him, and there would have been nothing that he could have done. But things were different now. This wasn't Wrath's true body. This was just a portion of its power, manifested by the greater relay. A John would be helpless, but Nick was a specialist or fanatic. While Wrath had tremendous power, there was no way to use it at this moment. The only threat was the CZE, but Nick could flee from her without any issues. At worst, he would just need to flee from the city and search for another one. Lastly, Wrath believed that Nick was a Specter. That meant that Nick wasn't allied with humanity, which was the only thing that would make him dangerous. In short, Nick was not the enemy, at least in their minds. This might actually be a good opportunity. "Food," Nick answered evenly, leisurely crossing his arms. "I didn't know you were a Specter as well." The CZE looked at Nick evenly, while Wrath narrowed its eyes in hatred. "Speak the truth or die. You are an initial fanatic. My servant is a peak fanatic. Attacking my servant is too risky," Wrath boomed with a deep voice. "It's the truth," Nick answered casually. "I assassinate people. Killing your servant is not difficult to me." "How?" Wrath asked, infuriated. Specters had many special abilities, but Nick was claiming that he could jump almost an entire level, which was crazy. "I'm not telling," Nick answered evenly. "You're not really here, you're just a greater relay." "I am not here, but my servants span the globe," Wrath spoke in a threatening voice. "I know who you are, I know where you are. Serve me or be hunted down by my servants." Nick's expression didn't change. "I can just join one of the other 6. Their powers will protect me from your powers." "Pointless," Wrath shouted. "Servitude is servitude. Serving me or others makes no difference to you." "But serving no one makes a difference," Nick answered. "Neutrality does not equate enmity." "Incorrect," Wrath shouted. "Servitude demands decisiveness. You are either for me or against me. Serve me or die." Nick looked at Wrath neutrally for a while. "Fine, I will serve you," he said. "Good," Wrath said with a malicious grin. Did Wrath believe that Nick would wholeheartedly serve him now? Of course not. No Specter would believe that. Among Specters, there were no true loyalties. The only way to hold one as a servant was by being the biggest danger to its life. As soon as a bigger danger came along, it would betray you for that danger instead. If there were a way to flee from Wrath, the Specter would do just that. Of course, the 7 corruptors knew that, which was why they reached an agreement. Stealing servants was forbidden. If they started stealing from each other, none of them would keep any. Servant was valuable, and if it encountered a stronger master from another corruptor, it would jump ship immediately. At which point it wouldn't matter who served whom, since none of the Specters would die anyway. They'd simply work for whichever master was strongest at the moment, needing only to be more valuable than the cost of managing them. Because of that, despite their hatred for each other, the trio of destruction and the 7 corruptors agreed that servitude was for life. They were allowed to kill each other's servants, but not to poach them. Nick hadn't known about that before he had accepted to become Wrath's servant, but Wrath very quickly explained it to him, albeit in a much more direct and shorter manner. "If anyone finds out you are my servant, they will kill you. There is no way to survive. You are bound to me forever." That was basically all he said. However, Nick wasn't really afraid or nervous. In fact, he was a bit excited. This might prove to be amazing for humanity and Aegis, Nick thought as he looked at Wrath's sculpture with boredom. There's no way for any human to enter the ranks of the Specters to gain inside knowledge. Communication between both sides is impossible since it's not possible that anyone from either side would help the other. Additionally, it's extremely easy to find out which side someone belongs to. I am the only person, or being, who can enter both sides. Naturally, I am still on humanity's side, but no Specter can possibly know that. Even more, they wouldn't even suspect me of being a servant from another Specter since, logically, the immediate danger in front of me is more dangerous than a distant one. And since Specters only follow logic, there's no way that I would purposefully choose to put myself in more danger than necessary. I have a unique opportunity to learn about the enemies of humanity from the inside. What can you do? Wrath asked with narrowed eyes. I'm good at assassination and staying hidden, Nick said. Naturally, Wrath wanted to know more about Nick's abilities, but it knew that Nick wouldn't tell him. The more Wrath pushed, the more likely it was that Nick would estimate his survival chances after escaping to be higher than staying here. Having a servant as a Specter was like holding a live eel in one's hands. As long as the eel believed that it wouldn't be killed, it wouldn't go too crazy. But if one pressed too hard and put it in too much danger, it would slide out of the hands and take its chances with flopping on the ground to escape. There was this unbreakable calculation of risk, the chance of an assassination attempt occurring, times the chance of it succeeding. If both numbers were too high, the servant would try to escape. Learning more about a servant raised the odds of killing it, but pushing too hard with threats also raised the odds it would bolt, trading a lower chance of success for a near-certain attempt. If that trade was worthwhile, the Specter would take it. So in the end, Wrath didn't ask about Nick's specific ability. Asking him meant that it couldn't make use of him as much. Can you hide amongst humans? Wrath asked. Don't need to, Nick answered. I just take what I want. Wrath remained silent for a bit. I don't need you in this city. I need you someplace else. But first, you need to know how to contact me for orders. My servant will teach you how to make a greater relay. Nick immediately became interested, but he didn't let it show. Okay. Chapter 622, Conjuring. Good, Wrath said as it looked with narrowed eyes at Nick. You are mine now. Don't even think about escaping. Then the statue turned back into a round stone, and all the power vanished from the major relay. Silence. A moment later, the CZE from the priesthood gestured for Nick to enter. Nick walked forward. Bang! And the door slammed shut in his face. Nick blinked a couple of times, then he waited. Ding! The door opened again, and the CZE gestured for Nick to enter again. This time, the door didn't immediately close. Nick successfully entered the room, and the door closed behind him. As soon as he entered, he realized why there were no other rooms on this floor. This entire floor was just the CZE's office. It was ostentatious beyond belief. The only office that was comparable to this one had been Marcus Julius' office in Crimson City. Followers of gluttony, huh? Nick thought as he looked around. You will be one of Lord Wrath's servants, the CZE spoke. Your life finally has meaning. Save your bullshit for your followers, Nick answered without looking at her. The CZE didn't show any strong reaction. I will now teach you how to create a major relay, she spoke evenly as she stepped forward. Nick turned around and looked at her. First, conjure a hollow stone that feels like this. Then Nick felt some invisible waves emanating from the CZE. This was the same thing that Nick had experienced when he had talked to the big rock snake. This was the Specters' unique way of communicating with each other. Back then, Nick hadn't been able to feel the true utility of this ability since the rock snake had only limited intelligence. But now, while he was talking to an intelligent Specter, Nick could see the ability's true potential. It was like the CZE was conveying the purest form of concepts to Nick. In almost an instant, Nick knew the dimensions of the stone, how it was supposed to feel to the touch, how it smelled, how it tasted, what it should contain, how hard it was, and all other kinds of things. It was like the CZE had simply spoken the word stone, and all related information was immediately conveyed. Conveying that much information via speech would need thousands of words and would require significant amounts of interpretation work to get just right. Nick knew exactly what this stone was supposed to be like. And how am I supposed to do that? Nick asked. Sure, Nick knew what the stone had to be like, but he couldn't just create it. It was like asking a child to split a solid piece of metal in two. The child understood what it had to do, but how was it supposed to accomplish that? Just conjure it, the CZE answered. How? Nick asked again. The CZE narrowed her eyes as she inspected Nick. She seemed like she felt suspicious of him. "The same way you made your clothing and weapons," she said evenly. "I didn't make either of those," Nick answered. The CZE furrowed her brows. When Nick saw that, he simply explained, "My weapons belonged to an initial specialist. The clothing belonged to a random expert." That didn't seem to resolve the CZE's doubts. "Do you not know how to conjure materials?" she asked. "Apparently I don't," Nick said. The next moment, more of these invisible waves entered Nick's mind, and he quickly learned how to conjure things. Nick had to do his best not to look shocked or surprised. He had never really thought about this. What were Specter bodies? What about Julian? What was part of his body? Was his blue hair part of his body? Was his clothing part of his body? Additionally, when a humanoid Specter got injured severely, how did their clothing repair itself? Specters were not known for having closets filled with clothing. Nick had seen many times how Specters had regained their damaged clothing, but he had never really thought about it. After all, it was of no consequence. No items or clothing conjured by a Specter had any impact on their powers. But yes, it was true. Specters could conjure matter out of seemingly nothing. Of course, something didn't tend to come from nothing. What the Specters used to conjure materials and items was their Zephyx. Specters could use the Zephyx they created to create things that they could use. However, it wasn't that easy. In order to create something with nothing but Zephyx in one's mind, one needed to understand almost everything there was to understand about something. Otherwise, the result would be basically useless, at least in terms of use for combat. If one didn't really know everything about something, they could still conjure a weak version of it. For example, if one tried to conjure steel with Zephyx but didn't know a lot about steel, one could simply create something that had the form of the steel but lacked almost all of the useful attributes. It would be akin to coloring a piece of paper gray. And that was how Specters repaired their clothing. They didn't need to know how fibers and cloth worked. A Specter's clothing didn't need any fancy attributes. It just needed to make it easier to convince humans that they were not Specters. However, if a Specter actually wanted to conjure something useful, it would need to learn almost everything there was to know about the thing they wanted to conjure. Zephyx was kind of a material for everything and could be transformed into any form imaginable. Of course, humans could also do this, but not without advanced machinery and not without a good amount of stored Specter Zephyx. This was what the entire field of Zephology was about, using Specter Zephyx to create powerful materials. Naturally, Nick knew quite a bit about Zephology by now. The very basis of it was translating a human's will into a form that could combine with Specter Zephyx, after which the two of them would fuse, and the Specter Zephyx would transform into the object the human's will imagined. Without advanced machinery, humans couldn't do that. Their wills were not inherently compatible with Specter Zephyx. They could digest it, but they couldn't manipulate it. It was like the difference between one's arm and a piece of meat. The human could digest both, but they could only control their arm. But this same restriction did not count for Specters. Their wills were compatible with their Zephyx. This made the use of advanced machinery unnecessary. A Specter could just imagine what it wanted, and the Zephyx would assume the imagined form. This was crazy. Nick tried his best to keep his expression as disinterested as before. "Never tried that," Nick commented as he held up his right hand. Then Nick imagined a red piece of cloth above his hand. The next moment, he felt his Zephyx slowly leaving his body and gathering above his right hand. Nick almost couldn't believe it when a tiny red dot appeared above his hand. The red dot grew bigger and bigger, and eventually, it grew to the size he had imagined. Finally, the red piece of cloth fell onto Nick's hand. Crack! Then the cloth tore apart and fell to the floor. It was not hard enough to resist its own weight and crumbled. However, this had just been Nick's first attempt. After a maximum of 10 attempts, he knew that he could create cloth that could be worn without immediately falling into pieces. "Make the stone," the CZE commanded. Nick didn't look at the CZE, but thought back to the attributes of the stones she had sent him earlier. Woo 'em! A huge amount of Zephyx gathered above Nick's right arm. The amount gathered was many times bigger than when he had conjured the piece of cloth. This was due to the stone's complexity and other attributes. The harder, more flexible, more tenacious, more anything the object was, the more Zephyx it required. Of course, the more complex the object was, the more focus the Specter needed to invest since there were more things to keep track of. Making something simple was like asking a normal person to remember a 4-digit code, while making something complex could be a 10-digit, 100-digit, or 1,000-digit code. After around 10 seconds, Nick stopped. In his hand was a small, curved stone that was barely a centimeter wide. Naturally, This wasn't nearly big enough for the major relay. However, Nick was low on Zephyx and needed to recover first. The CZE just kept watching Nick. A couple of seconds later, he continued building the stone. Based on his progress, he would probably need several minutes to finish one of them. CZE didn't show it, but she realized that Nick was becoming better at conjuring materials at a terrifying rate. Either this Specter had some kind of inherent talent for conjuring things, or it had learned a terrifying amount of information over its lifetime, giving it a powerful ability to learn. However, the CZE was only minorly curious. The talent didn't matter. In the end, this Specter was also just part of Wrath's army of servants. This talent changed nothing. Chapter 623, Natural and Artificial. Nick finished the first stone after about 30 minutes. "Make 6 more, the CZE commanded with an even tone. "I will be back later." Then she walked towards the exit. Nick didn't say anything and just continued looking at the tiny grain of stone he had just made. Naturally, Nick knew that the CZE had to keep up the illusion that she was a human. However, since she didn't tell him exactly what she was doing, he could only guess. Communication between them wasn't important. Both of them were servants of Wrath, and none of them wanted to be. If the CZE found a way to flee from Wrath without endangering her life, she would immediately do so. While the CZE did something, Nick continued making the stones. In the beginning, he felt a bit unsure about his ability to create them, but he quickly got the hang of it. It was surprisingly easy. This is probably a natural ability that almost all Specters have as soon as they are born, Nick thought. Maybe it's like how babies try to walk on 2 legs on instinct. Specters probably try to conjure things on instinct as well. It's basically just memorization and abstraction. I have to remember all the attributes I want, and then do some calculations to actualize them. Nick raised an eyebrow as he looked at the tiny grain. This is the best opportunity to experiment. I've barely invested anything into this little morsel. If I break it, it's no issue. At that moment, Nick stopped calculating and just thought about the attributes the stone should have. The Zephyx that Nick was releasing noticeably became more chaotic, and he quickly noticed that the quality of the stone wasn't as good as before. Sure enough, if I just use my instincts, it becomes terrible, Nick thought as he inspected the horrible stone. This is probably how normal Specters conjure things. A moment later, Nick started to calculate and theorize what his Zephyx should do before trying again, and sure enough, the stone he was conjuring became flawless again. Specters probably don't do that, he thought. The difference between what Specters were doing and what Nick was doing could be described with a human throwing a punch. Most people have seen punches thrown and assume they could do the same by emulating what felt correct, which tends to end in broken fingers or a broken wrist once real power is behind it. A human could keep throwing punches at a practiced target, letting instinct slowly rectify what felt right, and eventually learn to throw a good one. This was similar to how Specters conjured things. Someone with real experience in problem-solving wouldn't punch blind, though. Knowing enough biology and physics, they'd know to keep the wrist straight and the thumb clear of the fist, and that using the leg and back muscles generated far more power than the arms alone. They wouldn't have the correct feeling for it yet, but they'd already know what it was supposed to be, and the feeling would follow after just a few repetitions. Nick had learned a terrifying amount of information about all kinds of topics. One could almost call him an expert in every field. So, as soon as he realized how conjuring objects worked, many other concepts he had learned in the past overlapped with this one, and he very quickly analyzed and realized how exactly this was working. Additionally, since Nick was so used to learning things, he automatically theorized before trying to actualize something. Instead of relying on his feeling, he was manually calculating what he was supposed to do before doing it. This was the reason why Nick was so incredibly good at conjuring things. In short, he had a lot of experience in learning new things. Almost no Specters had the opportunity to accumulate this much knowledge. Most didn't care about learning these abstract concepts. They were just interested in becoming stronger. From the few that were interested, most couldn't even properly interact with humans. Lastly, they also needed a way to access that knowledge. Not every human could access advanced knowledge of a field. Julian had been one of the few Specters that had the means to learn about all kinds of topics, and he had used that knowledge to essentially conquer Crimson City. If Nick hadn't unveiled him, Julian would still be unknown and would continue growing until he became a governor. A Specter that knew a lot was extremely dangerous. The big-brain slug had a tremendous talent for conjuring things, but the complicated math behind its created labyrinth did not come naturally. Envy is probably similar, Nick thought with furrowed brows. I don't think that the ability to absorb and copy other abilities is that easy to use. Most likely, it supplemented its ability by learning a lot about itself and about what it could do, similar to the big brain slug. Nick continued creating the stones and kept analyzing how all of this worked. This makes almost the entire field of zephology obsolete, he thought as he watched the stone in his hand grow. The majority of zephology was about creating and programming the advanced machinery needed to influence the Zephyx, but as a Specter, Nick didn't need this. This was an extremely significant change. He could theoretically do things that were practically impossible in the traditional field of zephology. The possibilities are endless. After around 2 hours, Nick finished the 7 stones he needed to create and decided to use the remaining time to experiment. Eventually, the door opened again, and the CZE walked in again. She wordlessly took one of the stones and inspected it. Then, she transmitted the attributes of the circle of stones to Nick. These were more complicated in their makeup, but it didn't influence Nick's efficiency. 3 hours later, Nick finished that circle of stones as well. He received the attributes for the big stone that represented the Specter, and it was surprisingly simple. Nevertheless, due to the size of the stone, Nick needed a couple of hours again. In the end, he saw another major relay in front of him, and it looked identical to the one the CZE had created. Next, you need to imbue the stones with abilities, the CZE said. Nick was extremely interested but did his best to hide it. Imbue them with abilities. Is that similar to what I did to my Specter core before fusing with it? This is the hard part, and I expect you to learn it within the next decade, she spoke. Decade, Nick thought. You want me to waste an entire decade for this? Nick asked. Time has no value to you. You can't waste something that has no value, the CZE answered. Nick very quickly realized that she was right. Specters did not die of old age and did not grow weaker with age. They had infinite time. Sitting around and doing nothing for 5 minutes had the same effect as sitting around for 1,000 years. The next moment, the CZE sent a terrifying amount of information into Nick's mind. It was an explanation about how to create ability lines and what he needed to write with them. Nick only received the bare minimum to do what he needed to do to create the major relay. It took him a bit to digest all of the information. This is so different, he thought. The method the technician had created to manipulate the manipulation lines was completely different from what the Specters had made. Every little bit of the manipulation lines created by the technician were clear and had a use. Nick and the technician could calculate everything and could see what point every bit of the line had. But that was not true with the thing Nick had just received. This was extremely chaotic, and there were many lines that Nick could tell had no use. This chaos felt very natural. It was something that had been created over a long period of time by looking at what works and doesn't work. This was natural, while the method the technician had created was artificial. This was a brain, while the technician made a calculator. This method was impossibly efficient and far superior to what the technician had created. Yet, there was also something bad about it. It was not modular. This was one thing, and it could only be used in this exact configuration for this exact thing. Meanwhile, the method the technician had created had infinite potential and possibilities. If these two methods could be combined, wouldn't I be able to use every conceivable ability in existence? Nick thought.